Morgan Nick. Born on September 12, 1988, Morgan Nick was a bright, warm and loving little girl hailing from Ozark in Arkansas. Her parents described her as a shy girl on the quiet side who loved cats, and in 1995 she adopted her first kitten from the local shelter, whom she named Emily. The pair were inseparable, with Emily even sleeping at night next to her 6-year-old owner. The eldest of 3 children, Morgan became an active member of the Girl Scouts, particularly enjoying various indoor activities. She wasn't entirely sure what she was going to do when she grew up, often bouncing between being a circus performer and a doctor, or maybe, as she often considered, even both. No one could possibly have predicted that little Morgan Nick wouldn't have a chance to realize those dreams. At 9 p.m. on the night of June 9th, 1995, Morgan and her mother, Colleen, attended a Little League baseball game in Alma after a family friend invited them down. Towards the end of the game, at around 10:30 p.m, the 6-year-old became restless. When 2 of her friends came over and asked if she wanted to catch fireflies with them, she eagerly asked her mother, who said no. But Colleen eventually relented, frequently looking over to check on the children as they played nearby. 15 minutes later, at 10:45 p.m, the game ended. Colleen spotted the 2 children who'd been playing with Morgan, but not the little girl herself. The children said she was emptying the sand from her shoes over at Colleen's car, a Nissan Stanza. This was the last time that Morgan was seen alive, as when her mother approached the car, she found her daughter missing. Terrified, Colleen spoke to the local coaches, who questioned the other children further. They remembered seeing a man they described as creepy watching them earlier on, explaining that he was with a red pickup truck. They said that he'd spoken to Morgan earlier. The car was seen leaving at around the time the 6-year-old was last seen. When the police arrived on the scene, a huge manhunt for the missing girl was launched. Around 300 people were in attendance at the Little League game, which helped to provide police with multiple witnesses, some who saw the man, and some who saw Morgan at her mother's car. The children told authorities that the unidentified man had spoken to them all and asked them questions, but the nature of this conversation has never been released to the public. The FBI quickly got involved with the case, providing resources and manpower to the Alma Police Department. A sketch and description of the unknown man was released. In 1995, he was described as being between 23 and 38 years old, 6 foot tall, and 180 pounds. He was wearing blue denim shorts, no shirt or shoes, and had black or salt and pepper hair. He is also noted to have had a, quote, hillbilly accent. Combed back hair that could possibly have been curly, with a moustache, 3 or 4 days of beard growth, and a hairy chest. His car was described as being a dull red, older pickup truck with a white camper shell and rear damage on the passenger side. It is believed to have had Arkansas plates. His composite sketch resulted in over 4,000 tips. Morgan's disappearance is thought to have been linked with 2 other attempted abductions around the same time. On the morning of June 9th, a 4-year-old was pulled into a truck outside of a laundromat, but her mother managed to get her back. Then, on June 10th, a 9-year-old was forced into a men's restroom at a convenience store in Fort Smith, 10 miles away. Luckily, the girl was able to escape. In both cases, the reported abductor and his vehicle were described as being similar to those in Morgan's case. Fortunately, police have not been short of leads, and there have been countless sightings of Morgan across the US. However, law enforcement has had no luck in locating the young girl, or identifying her abductor. Even 2 decades later, Morgan's case continues to receive tips on a regular basis, something which the Alma police have noted is rare in older cases. On January 5th, 2002, police received a tip that was so specific they felt they had to investigate. It indicated that Morgan was buried in an area of private land in Boonville. They also used a dog in the search, but when it ended at 9:30 p.m, police decided not to return, having recovered nothing from the site. Then in November of 2010, federal investigators searched a vacant house in Spiro, Oklahoma, looking for DNA evidence that could show Morgan was once inside the house. The following month, they returned to this location to conduct a further search after receiving a tip. Cadaver dogs alerted them to a well on the property, which was the center of the investigation, but no evidence of Morgan's presence was ever found, and the search was eventually called off. Then, in August of 2012, two previously convicted felons, Tonya Smith and James Monhart, were arrested for computer fraud after attempting to utilize the 6-year-old's identity. They are not believed to have had any connection to the case, however. The most recent update to Morgan's case came in 2017, when a property was searched for any sign of her. The property belonged to a man who'd been a person of interest in the disappearance since the very beginning. He is reportedly now in jail on unrelated charges, but refuses to discuss the missing girl. If Morgan is still alive, she would be 32 years old. A docu-series about her disappearance is currently in the works. Her parents continue to hope that one day she will come home. Anyone with any information pertaining to Morgan's disappearance can call the Alma PD on 479-632-3333. Don Henry and Kevin Ives. On August 23, 1987, at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, the engineer on board a 75-car Union Pacific locomotive en route to Little Rock, Arkansas, spotted two bodies, motionless, lying on the tracks. The horn was blared, but the bodies didn't stir. The train was moving at over 50 miles per hour, and while the emergency brake was used, there was no way it could stop in time before it hit the bodies. At 4:40 a.m., the local police department arrived on the gruesome scene. The bodies were soon identified as 16-year-old Don Henry and 17-year-old Kevin Ives. The pair were best friends and popular seniors at Bryant High School. They had gone out hunting late that night. A torch and a rifle were found with the bodies. It is believed they were participating in what's known as the spotlighting method of hunting, which involves blinding prey before shooting. Interestingly, many of the witnesses on board the train claimed the boys were partially covered with green tarp, but the police never found a trace of it at the scene. The train's engineer claimed he'd told authorities about the tarp, while they later claimed that he hadn't. This was just the beginning of a long list of discrepancies in what is widely considered to be a botched investigation by the Saline County Sheriff's Department. The state medical examiner, a man named Dr. Malick, ruled the deaths of Kevin and Don as an accident that likely occurred because they had consumed so much marijuana. He claimed that they had smoked the equivalent of 20 marijuana cigarettes and then fallen asleep on the tracks. However, the parents of both boys were not convinced, finding it hard to believe that they'd lie down side by side in the same position, or that they could simply sleep through the sound of a train and its horn. They hired their own private investigator to do some digging, but he was met with resistance as he attempted to uncover what was really going on. Curiously, the PI found that the hospital that the boys had been taken to had no record of their presence, and that the staff of Dr. Malick had accused him before of falsifying autopsy records. He also found notes from the emergency responders who'd arrived on the scene that night that described how the blood of the two boys looked like it lacked oxygen, which raised questions about whether they were already dead when the train hit. In March of 1988, Dr. James Garriott of San Antonio offered a second opinion, stating that he was skeptical about the initial findings. He claimed that the only reliable way of testing for drugs was via mass spectrometry, a process which had not been carried out by Dr. Malick during the initial autopsy. The Saline County Sheriff at the time, a man named James Steed Jr., claimed there was no evidence to suggest that the boys' deaths had been anything other than an accident. In a letter which was published in the Benton Courier, Linda Ives, the mother of Kevin, heavily criticized the sheriff's department for their handling of the investigation. In response to this, in February of 1988, Sheriff Steed made a deal with Dan Harmon, the lawyer who was representing the parents of both Kevin and Don. If the parents withdrew their criticism of the sheriff's department, they would see to it that a proper investigation was launched into the boys' deaths. The second autopsy was carried out by Georgia medical examiner Dr. Joseph Burton. He found the equivalent of between 1 and 3 marijuana cigarettes in the boys' systems combined, a far cry from Dr. Malick's initial estimation of around 20. Don's shirt had evidence of stab wounds to its back, while Kevin's skull appeared to have been crushed, likely by the butt of his own rifle. As a result, the grand jury ruled the deaths as definite homicide. But despite this, Sheriff Steed refused to put money into the investigation. He was also found to have lied about where he sent the boys' clothing so it could be tested. It was meant to have been sent to the FBI, but instead he sent it to the Arkansas State Crime Lab. It was no surprise to anybody that, following his poor handling of the case, James Steed Jr. was not re-elected for sheriff. In the days following this defeat, one of Dan Harmon's informants, who was asked to take aerial photographs of the scene by Harmon, was murdered. This was just one in a long string of murders possibly connected to the case. 4 men who had been called to testify before the grand jury were found dead, either from murder or suspicious accidents, while another one disappeared. At least 3 of these men had links to the drug underworld of Arkansas. Due to the bungled investigation, there are not many suspects in the case of Kevin Ives and Don Henry. 1 week before the pair passed away, a man wearing military fatigues was spotted not far from the train tracks. When a police officer approached him, the man opened fire before disappearing into the night. On the night that the boys were found on the tracks, a similar-looking man wearing the same kind of clothing was spotted nearby. This man has never been identified, and it is unknown if he has any connection to the case. There was one local witness who did come forward with information possibly pertaining to the case. On the night of the boys' slayings, the witness saw 2 police officers beating 2 boys senseless in a store parking lot, before tossing them into a truck and driving away. It's unknown if these boys were Don and Kevin, or whether they had any connection to the case at all. Linda Ives, Kevin's mother, who has been extremely outspoken throughout the investigation, has stated her belief that the deaths are linked to drug trafficking. This theory involves the boys stumbling upon a drug drop from an aeroplane, suggesting that the boys were killed for stumbling upon something that they shouldn't have. A prosecutor named Richard Garrett, who had the bodies exhumed for a second autopsy, suspected this theory to be true. He claimed there was a lot of drug trafficking through the city of Bryant, which is connected to several other states. He has also stated his belief that a police cover-up has taken place in regards to the case of Kevin and Don. Then, on June 25, 1984, 2 young men in Ogden, Oklahoma were also run over by a train. Billy Don Hainline, 21, and Dennis Decker, 26, were found lying on the tracks side by side. While there was a small amount of alcohol in their systems, it was nowhere near enough to cause them to pass out. Their deaths have also been ruled as an accident. 1 month later, a meth lab was found about 1.5 miles from where the bodies were located. While this case was eventually reopened, no evidence of any foul play was found, and the official conclusion remains that they fell asleep on the tracks. Although this case may have nothing to do with that of Henry and Don, it shares eerie similarities nonetheless. In 1994, a video called The Clinton Chronicles was released, linking Bill Clinton to various crimes, including the deaths of Kevin and Don. The film propelled forward conspiracy theories, which involved Clinton allegedly using the Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport to smuggle drugs, guns, and money from Central America. 2 years later, in 1996, Linda Ives was involved in a film named Obstruction of Justice, which detailed the fumbled investigation and cover-up of an alleged drug ring in Saline County. The video also named some people who were possibly implicit in this alleged cover-up. A year later, in 1997, Dan Harmon was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and drug possession with intent to distribute, and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Tragically, in recent years, things have not improved for Linda or the other family members of Don and Kevin. In 2016, Linda filed a lawsuit citing a violation of the Freedom of Information Act by local, state, and federal authorities. She accused them of refusing to meet the record requests she had filed pertaining to the boys' case, and added that the documents she had been given were so heavily redacted that she couldn't make sense of them. However, her case was thrown out in 2019. The most recent development came in 2018, when a former pro wrestler named Billy Jack Haynes came forward to say that he had witnessed the executions. He claimed that Don and Kevin were slain after stumbling upon a drug deal involving corrupt police and high-level US politicians, adding that he was once involved in a cocaine smuggling network that stretched back to the Medellin cartel. According to Haynes, he was there to provide muscle during a drug drop, and while he denies having any part of the executions themselves, he says he helped to move and dump the bodies. Several of the people named in his confession were either murdered or convicted on drugs charges. Although this account has given hope to some, many find Haynes' confession to be unreliable. The former wrestler is notorious for inserting himself into situations and peddling conspiracy theories. He has, on multiple occasions, claimed that he knew the truth behind other deaths, including that of James Michael Frank, a judge and director of the New Mexico Corrections Department who was slain in 1989. As a result, many people do not find Haynes to be a credible witness. Although the case aired on the well-known TV show Unsolved Mysteries in 1988, and although a book was written about it by an investigative journalist named Mara Leverett, the deaths of John and Kevin have largely fallen from the public eye. To this day, their families still search for justice, and the murders of Don Henry and Kevin Ives remain unsolved. Cynthia Anderson. When James Rabbit entered his office on the morning of August 4th, 1981, he immediately knew something was amiss. The radio was playing, the lights and the air conditioning were on, and his desk, along with those of the other lawyers of his office, was prepared for the day ahead. But his legal secretary, 20-year-old Cynthia Jane Anderson, who went by Cindy, was nowhere to be seen. According to her loved ones, Cindy was a bright and generous young woman. She lived and worked in Ohio and was a devout Christian fundamentalist, along with the rest of her family with whom she lived. She was known to enjoy her job at the offices of lawyers James Rabbit and Jay Fieldstein on East Manhattan Boulevard, but did have intentions of leaving in 2 weeks so she could go to Bible college with her new boyfriend. As a result, her sudden, unexplained disappearance was considered to be strange and uncharacteristic. The morning that Cindy vanished from her workplace, she left no note to let her employers know that she was simply stepping out or running an errand. Authorities discovered that although her keys and handbag were gone, her car was still in its usual spot in the parking lot. She had also left behind her romance novel, which sat open on her desk. Upon checking Cindy's finances, investigators found that she'd left a healthy sum of money behind in her account. Neither her bank account nor her social security number has ever been used since she vanished. Upon speaking to her parents, her father noted that Cindy had recently been taking great care in her appearance, although this could be down to her having a new boyfriend. He also said that she had been skipping out on breakfast most mornings. While these things could be construed as odd, they were not necessarily cause for alarm. However, more concerning information was about to come to light. After asking around, law enforcement discovered several peculiar and disturbing pieces of information. To begin, they found out that for the past year, Cindy had been suffering from a recurring nightmare in which she was abducted and attacked by a man. Not only this, but at work she had been receiving odd phone calls, which caused her much distress. A colleague at her workplace told authorities that the day before she went missing, the 20-year-old received a phone call that upset her. When asked what was wrong, Cindy explained that this wasn't the first unsettling call she'd received. The unknown caller contacted her twice while the colleague was present. Earlier that year, Cindy's employers had installed an emergency buzzer at her desk, and she had become very particular about making certain the office door was locked at all times due to the calls she was receiving and the nightmares she was having. The crime scene was a baffling one to investigators. Although they had some worrying information to go off, the office showed no signs of a disturbance, and there was no forced entry. No calls were answered after 10 a.m., suggesting that it was around this time that something happened to Cindy. Another lead in the case came in the form of writing on a wall near her workplace, which read, "I love you, Cindy," by G.W., written by an unidentified man. The 20-year-old had noticed the writing 10 months before going missing. It was there for 6 months until it was covered up, but after a few weeks, it reappeared. Cindy was noted to have been extremely disturbed by this, understandably. It was initially unknown if the writing had anything to do with her disappearance, with the police investigating and clearing several men with the initials GW, including one maintenance worker for the building. However, the writer has since been identified and is not believed to be involved with Cindy's disappearance. Reportedly, he wrote the message for another woman named Cindy. Then, in September of 1981, law enforcement received a chilling, anonymous tip that claimed Cindy was being held against her will. The caller was nervous and refused to give her name, but told authorities that the 20-year-old was being kept in the basement of a white house and that there were 2 houses side by side that were owned by the same family. Reportedly, the family were on holiday, but their son remained, and it was he who was holding Cindy captive. The caller would not give an address and hung up when the investigator on the other end pressed her for more information. Although she did call back a few months later, she hung up once more when another member of law enforcement attempted to listen in on the call. The unidentified tipster has not called back since, and the validity of her tip is unknown. It seems that police never located the houses that she spoke about. Just another mysterious phone call in a case with far too many. One of the most talked about aspects of this case is the account that Cindy's romance novel was left open at a page where an abduction was taking place in the story. It is apparently the only violent encounter that the book contains. For some, this seems like a clue that was intentionally left behind, but others have wondered how likely it would be that Cindy just happened to be on that page on the day she vanished. It's even less likely that she managed to flip to the correct page before being abducted. The book has never been named in reports, so it's impossible for anyone to look for themselves at exactly what this could mean, with some online sleuths believing it's a hint left by an abductor, and many believing it's simply a red herring. Over the years, there have been several suspects in Cindy's case, and none of them has ever been officially ruled out. 2 convicted killers, Anthony and Nathaniel Cook, who killed 9 people between them in Ohio during the 1980s, have long since been suspected of being involved, but have repeatedly denied being entangled in this case. Another convicted killer, who has not been named but is serving time in prison in Ohio, is also suspected of having been involved in the case. However, no concrete link has ever been made between this man and Cindy. One of the most compelling theories is that which involves a lawyer at the firm Cindy worked for, a man named Richard Neller. He represented a drug dealer named Jose Rodriguez Jr., and the police theorized that perhaps Cindy overheard the two discussing Jose's criminal activity, and she was therefore silenced. In 1995, an informant testified at Jose's trial, claiming that he had confessed to killing the 20-year-old, but the informant's testimony was ruled as unreliable. Both Jose and Richard were later convicted and imprisoned on drug offenses. It's also noted that shortly after Cindy disappeared, 9 people were indicted on drug trafficking charges. Law enforcement suspect that at least one of them could know something about the disappearance, but so far, no new leads have turned up in the case. Outside of these theories, there is very little speculation. Most true crime enthusiasts suggest that perhaps Cindy left of her own volition. They reached this conclusion by pointing out that the office doors were locked that morning, that there were no signs of a struggle, and that the book was intentionally left behind by the 20-year-old. It is a comforting thought, but others have disputed the idea. They point to the fact that she appeared to have very little to no money on her, and her bank account had been left untouched. If she'd run away to start over, she'd require connections for a new social security number and a decent amount of money. The only other theory proposed in her case is that Cindy was extremely paranoid and suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness. Online users have questioned whether or not she really received harassing phone calls, or if she was the victim of her own anxiety, and possible psychosis. Cindy's parents never moved away or changed phone numbers. Her mother passed away in 1983, while her father followed 25 years later in 2008. If she is still alive, Sydney would be 59 years old. If you have any information, no matter how small, about Cindy, her whereabouts, or her abduction, you can reach the Toledo Police Department on 419-245-3340. Amy Billig. Described as a vibrant and talented girl, 17-year-old Amy Billig enjoyed writing poetry, reading books, playing both the guitar and the flute, and being a proud animal rights activist. By all accounts, she was popular and well-liked, which made it unusual and particularly heartbreaking when she went missing from Miami, Florida in 1974. On Tuesday, March 5th of 1974, Amy had plans to go out with her friends, but first she needed money, so she headed along Main Highway in her neighborhood of Coconut Grove in search of a lift to her father's workplace, an art gallery, where she intended to ask for a loan of some cash. Although most of us know better than to hitchhike alone nowadays, Amy felt safe in the neighborhood, and while the gallery was within walking distance, she had hitchhiked multiple times before, and so she was used to it and had no reason to fear that this trip would turn out to be any different than the dozens she'd taken before. But tragically, this time would be different indeed. Amy never made it to the workplace of Ned Billig, her father. She also never made it to the meeting with her friends later that day. Nobody had seen Amy, and no one had heard from her. Her parents quickly informed authorities, and an investigation was launched into the missing teenager's case. Early on in the initial investigation, the Billig family were approached by someone they thought was Amy's abductor. Over the phone, the perpetrator asked for $30,000 in exchange for the 17-year-old's safe return. But authorities soon learned that the caller was two 16-year-old boys, twins, named Charles and Larry Glasser. They were opportunists who had nothing to do with the case and had no idea as to Amy's whereabouts. Unfortunately, they wasted precious time and resources that could have been better spent. They were ultimately charged with extortion. While the police continued to look for clues, Susan Billig, Amy's mother, conducted her own extensive investigation, following up on tips and leads wherever she could. Her inquiry led her up and down the country, and she even travelled across the Atlantic Ocean to the United Kingdom in her attempts to locate her missing daughter. Among the tips that Susan and law enforcement received was the notion that Amy had been picked up and abducted by one of two biker gangs who had been travelling through the area at the time. One was known as the Pagans, while the other known as the Outlaws. Sources pertaining to Amy's case reference both gangs. Most focus on the Pagans, but both were equally dangerous, dealing in drugs, guns, and sex workers. Susan took hold of this potential lead and ran with it, searching desperately for any sign of her child. A family friend who had done some legal work for the Pagans managed to set up a meeting between Susan, Ned, and two members of the group. The couple learned during this meeting that these particular members hadn't seen their daughter, but it was frequent for gang participants to buy, sell, and exchange young women they'd abducted either for monetary gain or for material goods such as new bikes. The members assured the Billigs that they would look into Amy's disappearance by asking around about her, but they never found any further information, or if they did, they never let the family know. 3 months after the vanishing, Susan tracked the bikers down to Orlando, Florida. A convenience store manager here claimed that he recognized Amy as a girl who had been with the group. She was last seen with at least 2 members of the gang and had come into the store on several occasions to buy vegetable soup, as she was a vegetarian. Although this gave the family and law enforcement some hope, it sadly led nowhere. No new leads were picked up until a year and a half later, in January of 1976, when a man known as Dave called Susan and admitted that he used to, quote, own her daughter. He agreed to talk at his house, but acted nervous about the mother's arrival, concerned that she had been followed. Upon looking at Amy's photograph, he confirmed that this was the girl he used to own. He described her as extremely quiet, like a mute, and also noted her appendectomy scar, which had not been made public at the time. Dave agreed to look into Amy's whereabouts, and a few weeks later, he and Susan traveled to Oklahoma, where it was believed the teenager was being held. In June, they arrived at a pub where Amy was supposedly meant to be delivered to the pair, but instead, a fight broke out, and Dave was injured. Susan was whisked away to safety by several other bikers. She never saw Dave again, although at some point later, he told her lawyer that Amy was likely in Seattle. In November of 1977, Susan traveled to Seattle, despite having recently suffered a heart attack. She asked around, brandishing the photo of her daughter to the clients and staff in bars, clubs, tattoo parlors, and motorcycle shops, and had several witnesses claim to have seen Amy. Once more, she was described as being like a mute. Several years later, in winter of 1979, an anonymous male called the family and told Susan that Amy was at a truck stop outside of Reno, Nevada, and that she needed help. Although the FBI confirmed that the biker gang passed through there, they could not confirm that the young woman was with them. Across the course of this entire investigation, only one piece of evidence was recovered. Amy's camera was located at the Wildwood exit on a toll road known as Florida's Turnpike. It was found shortly after the teenager disappeared, and was turned in by a man who heard she was missing. This exit would have been on the route the biker gang took while heading north. It is unknown if Amy had the camera on her at the time she went missing. It may have been lost beforehand. Sadly, nothing substantial was recovered from the camera. Most of the photos that were developed were overexposed, while another simply showed a white van, giving investigators nothing to go on. During the late 1970s, a member of the Pagans named Paul Branch came forward to tell Susan that Amy was his girlfriend, and that he had lived with her for a while after purchasing her in Orlando. He said he was arrested a year later and left Amy with his roommate, but when he was released from prison, he found both of them gone, along with his motorbike. At some point, Branch also mentioned to Susan that her daughter was alive and being held by other members of the gang. However, after he passed away in the 1990s, Branch's widow claimed that he had recanted this confession on his deathbed, and told her that Amy had attended a party with the Pagans on the night of her disappearance. Upon becoming rude and mouthy, she was allegedly raped, but fought back, so she was forcibly given drugs until her heart gave out. Her body was reportedly disposed of in the Florida Everglades. Although this tragic and brutal tale might seem possible at first, it was later revealed that the widow had taken money from a documentary crew in exchange for sharing her story. Susan and the widow were filmed meeting by the crew. The validity of the claim was thrown into question as a result of the involvement of money. Many online sleuths and police investigators don't believe the story. It seems possible that the widow fabricated this information for the cash and attention it brought. That said, some of the details of the party described were confirmed by investigators, but those pertaining to the young woman's fate were not. Despite all of the confusion and the red herrings, we've yet to discuss perhaps the darkest and cruelest element that haunted the family during their investigation. Shortly after Amy went missing, her parents began to receive strange, disturbing phone calls from an anonymous male caller. He claimed that Amy had been abducted by members of an illicit sex ring organization and was being held captive. He described in detail what was being done to her. The caller tormented the family for 21 years, until 1995, when the FBI traced one of the calls to a man who used a mobile phone. Up until that point, the caller had used payphones, which had made it difficult to trace and apprehend him. The twisted individual who'd spent over 2 decades causing the family distress was revealed to be a man named Henry Johnson Blair, who worked for the United States Customs Department. He claimed that he was an alcoholic and that he had OCD, which had caused him to continually harass the family. a feeble excuse for the devastating pain he caused from his disturbing words. Blair claimed that he didn't know anything about Amy's vanishing and didn't know the girl personally. However, this statement came into question when law enforcement noticed the details of a man described in the teenager's journal. Amy wrote about a man named Hank, who she was considering running away with, as he had asked her to go to South America with him. Reportedly, Blair went by the nickname Hank, and his job required him to relocate to South America. He also had a van that matched the colour and model of the one shown in the photographs retrieved from Amy's camera. Despite these odd coincidences, Blair was never conclusively tied to Amy's case. In the end, Blair spent just 2 years in prison for harassing the family for 2 decades, and Susan settled a lawsuit against him for $5 million. In 1992, the hopes of the Billig family were raised once again when Susan was contacted by a private investigator who was working on Amy's case with a British investigator, who explained that while in Falmouth, England, he was approached by an American biker who was looking to sell a young woman. She was also American and described as a mute. However, he did not show a picture, and the British investigator passed away just a year later, resulting in the lead becoming a dead end. Fresh leads in Amy's case are scarce, and theories are very limited. Most online sleuths are in either one of 2 camps: that the biker gang knows something and is keeping quiet, or that Henry Johnson Blair knows something and is keeping quiet. Many argue how unlikely it would be for so many people to know the fate of the teenager and for not one person to come forward, while others feel that the bikers were simply messing around with a grieving family for kicks. On the other hand, some people believe Blair had nothing to do with the case, but was simply a sick and twisted individual who got some sort of thrill in hurting Amy's family, while others believe that the possible connection between him, the van Amy photographed, and her journal are too big of a coincidence to be ignored. Unfortunately, neither of Amy's parents will ever see justice for their missing child. Ned passed away in the early 90s after a battle with lung cancer, while Susan lived until she was 80 years old, passing away in 2005. Before her death, she co-wrote a book about her daughter's vanishing, titled Without a Trace: The Disappearance of Amy Billig, A Mother's Search for Justice. Amy's case was also featured on Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. Sadly, to this day, her disappearance remains unsolved. If Amy is still alive, she would be 63 years old. During her time with the biker gang, she may have used the aliases Mute, Sunshine, Little Bits, and Mellow Cheryl. If you have any information in regards to Amy's whereabouts or her abduction, you can reach the authorities on 305-476-5423. Simonetta Ferrero. July 24th, 1971 started off like any other day for Simonetta Ferrero, a 26-year-old woman living with her parents and 2 sisters in Milan. The family was getting prepared for a holiday to Corsica, where they would spend 1 month soaking up the sun and splashing about in crystal clear waters. Simonetta was, as one would expect, excited about the trip. The family's flight was later on that evening, but first, the young woman had some errands to run. Just before 10 a.m. that morning, Simonetta left her home and headed out. At 10:37 a.m., she purchased a French-Italian dictionary. Simonetta was also known to have exchanged currencies at this point, and went on to visit a perfume shop where she bought cosmetics. Although the 26-year-old had a few other things to attend to after this, including a beautician's appointment, she did not show up. At some point after 11:30 a.m., Simonetta visited the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, a prestigious university in Milan, and one which the young woman had recently graduated from after studying political science. Given that it was a Saturday and the height of summer, the university was mostly empty. A few students milled around and a custodian was present, but other than that, and the 4 labourers who were noisily jackhammering, there was no one else at the establishment that day. It is unknown why Simonetta visited the university, and many of the reports pertaining to her case conflict with one another. While some claim she wanted to make photocopies for a friend, others state she was grabbing a book for a friend, or others say she wanted to pick up a leaflet, or even simply use the bathroom. None of these reasonings for why the young woman entered the building have ever been substantiated, and the alleged photocopies she was supposed to make were actually found in her bedroom at home. Evidently, she'd already completed that task. At around 1 p.m. the same day, Simonetta's family sat down to lunch. While at first they were agitated she hadn't appeared on time, they grew concerned when the clock struck 4 and she still had not returned. The family notified the police and cancelled their holiday as an ominous feeling loomed over them. A few days later, on Monday 26th at around 9 a.m, the university's seminarian, a 21-year-old man named Mario Toso, walked down the halls of the building. He was surprised to hear a tap running from inside a girl's bathroom, and, feeling that this was wasteful, he made his way inside. He noted that the door handle felt sticky beneath his palm, but he was even more shocked when he stepped in and was struck by a foul smell and a horrifying sight. There, lying in the middle of the floor in a large pool of blood, was 26-year-old Simonetta Ferrero. The scene was a bloodbath. There were smears of the red substance on the bathroom stalls, on the walls, and in the sink. Police were quick to arrive at the university and were astounded by the brutality of the crime. Simonetta, who was later identified by relatives as her family had collapsed in shock and her father had taken ill upon hearing the news, had been stabbed a total of 33 times, mostly in the abdomen, chest, and neck. Only 7 of these wounds were fatal. It was clear from the get-go that Simonetta had put up an intense struggle with the perpetrator. She had numerous defensive wounds and even had skin beneath her fingernails. Unfortunately, given the limited forensic techniques in 1971, this led nowhere. A bloody handprint left behind by the culprit indicated that they were between 5'9" and 6 feet tall. It was estimated that Simonetta had been slain between 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. on the day she was last seen alive. Suspects in Simonetta's case were limited, and over the years, most theories were discarded almost as soon as they were considered. Authorities interviewed and investigated the custodian and labourers who'd been in and around the building on July 24th and seized their clothing, but eventually all 5 of them were dismissed as suspects. Investigators believed that the jackhammers, which had been used all morning and afternoon, likely covered up any screaming from Simonetta. None of the men had seen anything or anyone suspicious on the university's grounds. Due to the complex structure and layout of the university, law enforcement suspected that the perpetrator must have been someone who was familiar with the grounds and the building. As a result, they narrowed their focus down to students, teachers, and regulars. Mario, the man who'd found the body, was also perceived as a suspect at first because after alerting the authorities, he had left and gone back to his hometown. However, he arrived back in the area 2 days later with no injuries that would be consistent with those that Simonetta had inflicted upon her executioner. Police also couldn't find any blood on any of his clothing. As a result, Mario was cleared as a suspect, and it's believed that he fled in fear and shock. Another lead in the case came in the form of strange men who'd been seen harassing female students at the university. One man in particular was known to carry a knife on a train travelling from Milan to Saronno, on which he threatened women passengers. In his house, police uncovered a diary that disturbingly read, quote, "I hate women," and "I want to kill them all." However, this man was later dismissed as a suspect when he was entered into a mental health facility. At this point, leads in the case began to dry up. Simonetta was described as a serious and hard-working woman who was very career-driven and rarely, if ever, entered into relationships. Family and friends claimed that while she had had a few flirtations, she'd never seriously dated anyone. Thus, there were no rejected lovers in her life, nor any jealous ex-boyfriends. She came from a wealthy background and worked at the same company her father did, interviewing prospective employees. In her free time, she volunteered with the Red Cross, and according to her childhood priest, she was even considering becoming a nun. Authorities wondered if the attack was sexually motivated, but tests confirmed that Simonetta had not been sexually assaulted. They then wondered if she'd been slain for financial gain, but found that her gold jewellery was all intact, as was the money in her handbag. It was then questioned whether or not she had ruffled any feathers in the workplace, but authorities found nothing here either. By the end of August 1971, 356 people had been interviewed by authorities, but they were left with nothing. Over the course of the following years, a few men attempted to confess to the crime, but all were proved to be hoaxes. Simonetta's case quickly came to a dead end. It was in the spotlight once more in 1994, when a prefect of Milan who'd worked the case received an anonymous letter. The letter detailed the case of a Venetian priest who'd worked at the university in 1971, but was removed 3 years later for sexually harassing a student. Yet again though, this lead went nowhere, and Simonetta's case faded from the public's memory as it continued to grow cold. There are a few other theories connected with Simonetta's slaying. For a time, it was speculated that her death was linked with that of 11 other women who were killed between 1970 and 1975 by an unknown serial killer. The perpetrator targeted ordinary women like Simonetta as well as sex workers, but this theory has since been abandoned. The case was also thought to possibly be related to another murder that occurred in January of 1987, but this idea has also been thrown out. In the decades since, there have been far more questions in Simonetta's case than there are answers, or even theories. We may never know what happened to her that summer's day, and it's possible that her killer, whoever he or she may be, still walks free, having gotten away with brutal murder. Wilma Montesi. The strange, unexplained death of Wilma Montesi is messy, unclear, and complex. It also has attached to it an extensive scandal involving drugs, sex parties, high-powered politicians, and Rome's elite. To this day, it is still unresolved, and although it was labelled by police at the time as an accident, speculation about what really happened to Wilma on the day she dies continues to be discussed, and nobody believes it was simply an unfortunate mishap. At around 5:19 p.m. on April 9, 1953, 21-year-old Wilma Montesi was seen leaving the 3-roomed apartment she shared with her family in a suburb of Rome. Described as a quiet and reserved woman, Wilma was engaged to be married to a police officer who was from Potenza and lived a fairly unextraordinary life, although she had big dreams of entering the world of cinema and show business. She had even made an uncredited appearance in the 1952 film Ergastolo, also known as Prison. Upon leaving her home, witnesses placed Wilma as being on a train going from Rome to Ostia, which was about 20 kilometers away. While the young woman's family noted that she had no knowledge of public transport, police seemed satisfied that she did indeed take the train of her own volition. From here, Wilma headed to a beach called Torvajanica, where the owner of a kiosk selling postcards claimed that she had seen and spoken with a young woman who resembled Wilma, and that she bought an illustrated postcard which she intended to send to her boyfriend in Potenza. After this, the 21-year-old's movements are unknown. Several days later, on April 11th, a labourer who was having breakfast at the beach found the body of a young woman lying on the shore, with her head immersed in the water. She was partially dressed, with her handbag missing. She also had no shoes, stockings, or garter belt. While most reports state that she had no skirt, it appears from crime scene photos that she did, and that it was perhaps the slip underneath that she was missing. News of this unidentified woman quickly broke, and although authorities banned press from entering the mortuary, one journalist posing as a lawyer managed to get through. In the article he wrote following his visit, he described the young woman in great detail, which allowed Wilma's father to identify Jane Doe as his missing child. While law enforcement managed to construct more of Wilma's final day, or her presumed final day, it didn't offer much more in the way of clues. Reportedly, her mother and sister had spent the afternoon at the cinema watching The Golden Coach, and although they'd asked Wilma to accompany them, she had declined. She told them that she'd rather go for a walk instead. When Wilma's mother and sister returned later on, she wasn't there. They found it odd that she'd left behind her ID and the jewellery she'd been gifted by her boyfriend, which she always wore when she went out. The police found that the building's caretaker had seen the young woman leave, but he hadn't seen her return. Wilma's body was taken to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Rome for examination, and the death was quickly ruled as accidental. Medical experts concluded that she had gone to the beach to soak her feet in the seawater as they were sore from her new pair of shoes, but that she ultimately fainted and drowned. Wilma apparently couldn't swim, and they argued that her sudden illness was due to her period, which had been present at the time of her death. There were reportedly no traces of drugs or alcohol in her system, and the distance between where she was last seen and where she was found was explained away by investigators as being due to the sea currents. There are conflicting reports about whether or not the 21-year-old was sexually assaulted. The first autopsy showed that she had not, as they determined that Wilma was still a virgin, but later examinations noted the presence of sand inside of her, which led to the speculation that there had been an attempted sexual assault, but that it had failed. While the police were satisfied with the autopsy outcome and closed Wilma's case just 5 days after her body was found, the general public and the press were not so easily swayed. After the case was closed, theories began to circulate. She could have taken her own life, but her family argued that she showed no signs of depression and noted how excited she was about her upcoming wedding. Journalists wondered if her parents were so quick to dismiss the idea of suicide because they were a Christian family, and they wanted her to have a proper burial. Others have questioned why Wilma would take such a long journey just to either take her own life or dip her feet in the water. And since she was expected home for dinner, why make the journey at 5:30 in the evening? It's also been asked numerous times, why did Wilma remove her suspender belt when she was simply dipping her feet in the water? Another theory about Wilma's demise was that her uncle was involved. Apparently the young man had encouraged her to break off her engagement. He was also seen as somebody who lived outside of societal norms by consorting with society's undesirables and those of a dubious nature, which meant that the general public found him to be an unsavory character, and they took this theory very seriously. While he at first refused to give an alibi, he later relented, telling investigators that he'd been with his girlfriend's sister. He later had 2 children with this woman. What no one could have expected was for the case to devolve in the way it did over the next few years. Prominent figures in cultural, political, and judicial systems were called out for reportedly taking part in drug-fueled sex parties, and many were said to have been involved in consorting with sex workers and known criminals. It's at this point in Wilma's case that things start to become unclear. As journalists began to investigate, several proposed the idea that the theory of death being accidental was a cover-up to protect high-powered politicians and the elite and wealthy in Roman society. According to reports, the aforementioned sex parties took place in an estate near where Wilma's body was found, and was managed by a man named Marquess Ugo Montagna. This man was friends with the son of Italy's foreign minister, who later resigned due to the scandal exploding around his son. Newspapers received letters from all across the country, with one claiming to have observed a man in a car with a woman who resembled Wilma driving through the estate. The driver was later identified as the nephew of the last king of Italy, and was, at one point, charged in Venice for being involved in crime. Marquess and Piero, the son of Italy's foreign minister, were also sent to Venice in 1957 to stand trial, where they'd been charged with being accessories in Wilma's death. A police chief was also tried for being involved with the cover-up. He was the same man who'd opted to close the case 5 days after the body was found. During the trial, Piero's actress girlfriend confirmed that the couple had spent the days leading up to the incident together in Ravello. He returned home on the 9th, but had an alibi thanks to the doctors and nurses who attended to him while he was homesick. Ultimately, all 3 men were acquitted when judicial authorities concluded that there could not be a cover-up and they could not be accessories to the crime, as far as they were concerned, no crime had been committed. Wilma's death was an accident. Much of these alleged revelations about the estate came to light because of an ex-girlfriend of Marquez, a woman who often went by Ana Maria. She claimed that he was running a drug ring and accused him of being involved with the disappearances of several women. She also said that Marquez used Piero as an assassin, and that she'd heard the two discussing getting rid of Wilma, who, for a short time, had apparently been a lover of Marquez. These accusations were enough for an investigation to be opened, but, as we mentioned earlier, it saw no results. Around about this time, a journalist named Silvano Muto proposed the theory that Wilma had been a drug runner and that she had overdosed at the estate during one of its infamous sex parties. His evidence came in the form of another wannabe actress, Adriana Basacchia, who claimed to have participated in an orgy with Wilma. She said she'd consumed too much alcohol and drugs and ultimately overdosed, so her body was taken and dumped on the beach. However, authorities chose to ignore Silvano and put him on trial for spreading false and tendentious news to disturb public order. And during the trial of those suspected to have been involved with Wilma's death, Ana Maria herself was essentially torn to shreds, her evidence ridiculed. Silvano spent 2 years in prison, while Adriana was given a 10-month suspended sentence. Ana Maria later stood trial herself, and in 1966 she was given 2 years in prison. The media portrayed Wilma as a good girl who just happened to meet a tragic end. She was buried in her wedding dress. Although her case remains cold, in 2015 a criminologist and journalist investigated case documents which were previously thought to have been lost. He concluded that her death was connected to her private life, and that an important thread of investigation had been overlooked and not thoroughly explored. Unfortunately, with the amount of time that's passed and the lack of forensic evidence, it seems very unlikely that we'll ever know what truly unfolded in the final hours of Wilma's life. Stephen Damman. Stephen Craig Damman was born on December 15th, 1952, to his proud parents Jerry and Marilyn. While he was born in Michigan, the couple relocated to Long Island, New York, where Jerry was stationed as part of his career in the Air Force. Stephen was just 2 years old at this time. On October 31st, 1955, Halloween, Marilyn went to the local supermarket with her 2 children in tow, Stephen and his 7-month-old sister Pamela, who was in a pram. They were only a block and a half from their home. Although it seems an extremely absurd thing to do now, back then it was a socially acceptable thing for a busy mother to leave her children outside the store while she headed inside for some brief errands. In this instance, Marilyn left her 2 children at the door and headed in for a loaf of bread. When she emerged just 10 minutes later, the pair were gone. Luckily, Pam was found quickly in her pram by a family friend who brought her back to her frantic mother, but 2-year-old Stephen was nowhere to be found. The police were quickly alerted and a large manhunt was soon underway, with even the military taking part. 5,000 volunteers helped to search for the missing boy, but no sign of him was ever found. Then, Jerry and Marilyn began to receive ransom letters. The first asked for $3,000 for Stephen's safe return. The next asked for $10,000, and the final one asked for $14,000. While the distraught couple attempted to comply with their son's abductor, it was soon found that the letters were a hoax and were written by a student at Queens College in New York City. The student had nothing to do with the abduction and was simply an opportunist. For Marilyn and Jerry, hopes of being reunited with their beloved son were suddenly dashed. At one time, Philadelphia's famous John Doe, the boy in the box, was thought to be possibly the missing child. Both were blonde and blue-eyed with the same scars, but John Doe, who was found in 1957, didn't have the same healed arm fracture that Stephen did. They also didn't have the same footprints. In 2003, DNA conclusively proved that John Doe was not Stephen Damman. Theories relating to Stephen's case are very limited, considering how little evidence was found at the scene. There were no witnesses, no forensics, nothing. Some online sleuths have suggested that perhaps he was kidnapped to be raised by another family, but if this was the case, why would they not take Pam as well? It's been speculated that maybe the abductor became overwhelmed trying to wrangle a boisterous toddler as well as the pram, and decided to leave Pam because she wouldn't remember anything, or be able to identify them in any way. It has also been postulated that perhaps Stephen attempted to take the stroller for a walk, but was either lured away or got bored and wandered off. He could have been in an accident or become lost. Others, however, have disputed this, given the clunky nature of 1950s prams and the rather high height of the bar used to push them. Another detail of interest is the healed arm fracture that Stephen had. Many armchair detectives have wondered if this was an accident or whether it was physical abuse. This has led to the idea that perhaps Marilyn was involved with her son's disappearance. A video on YouTube has been closely linked with Stephen's case, in which an elderly woman claims that she's the Damman's former neighbour and claims that Marilyn was abusive towards her son. She also alleged that she had witnessed the physical abuse and had reported it. She added that she suspected the body had been buried beneath a walkway that was being constructed at the time. However, physical evidence is, of course, lacking, and the video includes no proof of the elderly woman's connections with the Damman family. So all of this is alleged and should be taken with a pinch of salt. Many online sleuths don't put much stock in this video at all. It's unknown if the authorities are aware of this video and whether or not they've fully investigated it. Stephen's case took another turn in 2009 when a man named John Barnes came forward claiming that he might be the missing boy. John, a 54-year-old man from Michigan, had the same facial scar and calf mole as Stephen. He claimed that he never fit in with his family and that he didn't look anything like his parents, but this was heavily disputed by his sister, who noted that everyone said he looked much like his father. John added that Marilyn looked familiar to him when he saw a picture of her from the 1950s. According to John, his curiosity was piqued when his mother, who was dying of lung cancer, requested that he come and visit her alone. He obliged, and although she never told him point blank, he became convinced that she was trying to tell him that she was not his biological mother. John said his mother was too full of drugs to really say it, but he was sure that's what she was attempting to communicate. He became all the more certain when he researched missing children and stumbled across Stephen's information. While John's father and sister were stunned that he thought he wasn't related to the family, he remained confident. He met with Pam, now an adult with children herself, who noted that she didn't think he was her brother, but the two did become close friends regardless. That same year, a DNA test was carried out by the FBI. John was found to not be the missing Stephen Damman, leaving the family in limbo once more. Updates on Stephen's case are few and far between. After his disappearance, Marilyn and Jerry Damman moved to Iowa before divorcing in 1957. Jerry continues to live there, where he remarried and had 2 more sons, while Marilyn now lives in Missouri. Jerry has said that he hopes one day he'll find out what happened to Stephen on that Halloween of 1955, but for now, his case remains unsolved. Kaim Weiss. Kaim Weiss was 15 years old in 1986. An intelligent and studious young boy, Kaim had spent the last 2.5 years of his life at the Torah High School in Long Beach, New York. This private school was designed specifically for Jewish boys and emphasized the religious and ethical principles of Orthodox Judaism. By all accounts, he was a popular and well-liked boy with no known enemies, which makes his murder on Halloween 1986 all the more shocking. On the morning of November 1st, Detective Don Daly was called to the school to investigate when Kaim Weiss was found dead in his dorm room. The 15-year-old had received a blow to the back of his head while he slept with what was at first an unknown weapon, although later reports noted that the small cuts on his head could indicate that a hatchet-like object was used. He had been executed in his sleep, and according to the evidence in the room, had been moved onto the floor before being moved to another spot on the floor in the room. Despite it being cold out, Kaim's window was open. These two factors have often led to the theory that whoever killed Kaim was familiar with the traditions of his religion, as his body had been moved to its lowest and coolest point, and the window had been opened to allow his spirit out. There was no evidence of robbery present in Kaim's room, nor were there any signs of a struggle. As the young boy lived on the 3rd floor, it is thought to be impossible for the intruder to have entered or escaped through the window without a ladder, which would have likely been spotted by other students. One of the pupils of the school also noted that the perpetrator would have had to have maneuvered through several common rooms and hallways, past other students and teachers, to get to Kaim's dorm. For many online sleuths, this has indicated that the young boy's slaying had to have been carried out by someone familiar with the building and who could go by unnoticed. After Kaim's demise, a memorial candle was placed in his room before it was sealed up. 2 days later, another candle appeared, but oddly, when asked, nobody came forward to take responsibility for placing it there. Although this is thought to have been carried out by a forgetful and absent-minded rabbi, it's still a strange detail mentioned in most articles pertaining to the young boy's case. Due to the Jewish Sabbath that was ongoing, Detective Don Daly couldn't immediately interview any of the students and teachers of the school. When he was finally able to, however, there was some reluctance by the school's populace to respond. This was thought to have been because of religious restrictions that meant they could not come forward without concrete evidence or another eyewitness backing up their claims. While this must have been unfathomably frustrating for the local law enforcement investigating the case, there was not much that could be done about it. While little progress was made on this front, Don did manage to piece together the last few hours of Kaim's life. On Halloween night, the 15-year-old left class with his friends to attend services. He returned to his dorm after. Notably, Kaim was one of 2 boys who did not have to share his room. While most pupils shared with 1 or 2 other people, Kaim was an exception to this. It is unknown what exactly made a pupil eligible for this perk. Several hours after the young boy returned to his room on October 31st, he was seen by his classmates reading in the hallway. This was normal because students did not leave their lights on in their room during the Sabbath. Kaim was last seen alive at around 1 a.m. that night. No students reported any suspicious or abnormal activity. While one boy did observe Kaim's dorm room quickly opening and closing at one point during the night, he assumed that it was just his roommates, unaware that Kaim lived in the room alone. In total, around 40 students and rabbis were administered polygraph tests, but this did not help to propel the investigation forward. As we've mentioned many times, polygraph tests are famously unreliable and rarely do anything to benefit an investigation. Another witness, a jogger, had seen a student of the school on the boardwalk at around 7 a.m. on the morning of November 1st and noted that the young boy looked out of place. But this student has never been identified, and it's unknown if he has any relevance to the case at all. The list of suspects in Kaim's case was very short. With so little to go on, police struggled to find answers and had very limited evidence which they could use to progress in the investigation. One suspect was a former janitor of the school, who Kaim was thought to have had a run-in with, while another was a mentally ill man who had attacked several senior citizens in their homes near the school that year. However, both of these individuals were swiftly ruled out. In 2013, the 15-year-old's case was reopened, and over 100 former students were interviewed. Then, in 2015, police announced their belief that a student or faculty member had been the one to commit the crime. Although earlier theories speculated that Kaim had been the subject of a hate crime, this idea was soon dismissed because he had clearly been so specifically targeted. In November of 2017, Kaim's father, Anton, was interviewed by a news station and recalled several odd incidents during the lead-up to Kaim's death. In July of 1986, just months before Kaim's death, he called his father from summer camp and asked if he could come home. Anton reported that his son was crying at the time and seemed deeply troubled, but he was away on holiday in Florida at the time and couldn't come to collect Kaim. When he stopped by at the camp on his way home, he reported that the 15-year-old seemed fine, and it appeared like everything was okay, so he thought nothing more of it. Then, in August, while Kaim was away visiting his grandparents in Europe, his principal, Rabbi Avram Cooper, called Anton multiple different times, asking when his son would be home. On another occasion, the rabbi asked Anton to bring his son by his home so they could talk alone. After the 10-minute meeting, Kaim returned to his father, but refused to tell him what had been discussed. As a result of these details, Anton Weiss believes that Rabbi Cooper has some information on Kaim's murder that he has not disclosed. Many online sleuths suspect his involvement with the murder, especially since it seems obvious that the 15-year-old was not only targeted, but that his death was at the hands of someone on the inside of the school. This line of thought was amplified when the Weiss family took Torah High School to court for failing to keep Kaim safe. This court case came about when it was discovered that there was no dorm counselor assigned that night, and that the lock on the dorm building's back door had been broken and never replaced. During this, Rabbi Cooper reportedly told Anton that he should reflect on any bad deeds he might have done as a way of considering why bad fortune had come upon his family. In recent years, a former student has come forward claiming that a rabbi at the school had physically abused him, subjecting him to frequent, violent beatings. He alleged that Rabbi Cooper knew of this, but did nothing to stop it. This abuse occurred around a decade before Kaim's murder. The student was 14 at the time, and lasted only around a year in the school before leaving. It's also noted that another student hanged himself in the showers several years before Kaim's death, although he is believed to have suffered from severe depression. It's unknown if this student had any connection to the abuse allegations or whether these allegations were thoroughly investigated. As it stands today, despite the efforts of local law enforcement, Kaim's brutal murder continues to go unsolved. Charlie Ross. Charles Brewster Ross, who generally went by the nickname Charlie, was America's first kidnapping for ransom victim back in 1874. Despite the fact that his case is nearly a century and a half old, it continues to go unsolved, and the fate of Charlie Ross remains unknown. Charlie was born on May 4th, 1870 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to Christian K. Ross and his wife Sarah Ann, and had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. The couple were, for a time, relatively well off, and lived in a large mansion in Germantown, a well-to-do area of Philadelphia. On July 1st, 1874, Charlie and his 6-year-old brother Walter were playing in the family's front garden. Sarah Ann was away in Atlantic City, recovering from an illness, while Christian spent most of the day working at his store. The children were watched over by the home's servants. When Christian returned home from work, he was not immediately alarmed to find that Walter and Charlie were not in the front garden, as one of the maids claimed they had seen the boys playing out on the street with friends. However, Christian was soon alerted by a neighbor who'd witnessed the boys being taken away in a horse-drawn carriage. It was later uncovered that over a period of several days, 2 men had supplied the children with sweets, and on July 1st, they'd approached and offered Charlie and Walter not only sweets, but fireworks too. They promised the children they'd get both of these things if they agreed to ride with the strangers. The boys agreed, but shortly after pulling away from their home, 4-year-old Charlie began to cry. Walter was dropped off at a local store and given money to buy fireworks, but when he returned, the kidnappers and his brother were gone. Walter was soon reunited with his family by a local citizen, but Charlie remained missing. On July 3rd, Christian placed an ad in the local paper, offering $300 for his son's safe return. Soon after this, he began to receive ransom letters from the apparent kidnappers. The letters came in the form of notes mailed from post offices in Philadelphia and beyond, and they were written poorly. The handwriting was described as odd, while the writing itself barely literate, with extremely poor spelling and grammar. The ransom letters demanded $20,000 for the safe return of Charlie, which is the equivalent of around $450,000 today. The kidnappers cautioned the family against contacting law enforcement and threatened to hurt Charlie if Christian did not cooperate. However, by this point in time, the Ross family had lost a considerable amount of their wealth. Although they continued to live in a large house in an affluent area, Christian's store was beginning to buckle due to the stock market crash of '73, and the family was heavily in debt. As a result, they simply could not afford the ransom demands. The family saw no way out, and so they contacted their local police department. Several prominent Philadelphians enlisted the help of the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, the same agency which we've covered on a previous episode of Cold Case Detective, discussing Dorothy Arnold. The agency printed thousands of flyers and posters featuring Charlie's likeness, and while the police officers conducted one of the 19th century's biggest manhunts, they could not locate the missing 4-year-old. While several attempts were made to deliver the ransom money to the kidnappers, each time the perpetrators failed to appear. After 23 notes, Charlie's abductors ceased communicating with his family. The case took a twist 5 months later when, on the night of December 13th, the house of a judge living in Brooklyn was burgled. The judge's brother, who lived next door, gathered members of his household and they each armed themselves with weapons and set out to catch the intruders. The men gunned down both burglars, career criminals named Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas, who were recently released from jail. While Mosher was killed instantly, Douglas lived 2 more hours and was able to briefly communicate with the men who'd shot him. It seems to be rather unclear exactly what Joe Douglas said that night, but the general consensus appears to be that he admitted that he and Mosher had abducted Charlie Ross. But he also said that his now dead partner knew the current location of the 4-year-old. After this, however, his statements became unclear again. There is some confusion over whether he admitted that Charlie was dead or whether he stated that the boy would be returned to his family in a few days. It seemed to be agreed upon that Douglas would have no reason to lie, because he knew he was dying when he confessed. If Charlie was still alive at the time the 2 men passed away, he was never returned to his family. Soon after this, Walter Ross was taken to New York to see if he could identify Mosher and Douglas as the men who'd taken Charlie that day in July. Walter immediately recognized them, especially Mosher, who had a distinctly malformed nose, as the cartilage had been destroyed by cancer. It was soon discovered that a disgraced policeman named William Westervelt was an associate of Bill Mosher, and also his brother-in-law. Westervelt was arrested and held in connection with the case, and in 1875 he was tried for Charlie's kidnapping. While awaiting trial, Westervelt apparently told Christian that Charlie was alive at the time of Mosher's death. However, the former police officer could not be tied to the crime, and Walter insisted that he was not one of the kidnappers. Subsequently, Westervelt was found not guilty of kidnapping, but was convicted of a lesser conspiracy charge and ultimately served 6 years in prison, though he continued to maintain his innocence throughout his sentence. In the first year alone following Charlie's kidnapping, 600 sightings flooded in from all across the country, but sadly, none of them panned out. 2 years after he went missing, Christian's father wrote a book about the case and had it published. He used the money he made from his best-selling novel to continue his search for his son's whereabouts. By 1878, the media frenzy surrounding the case began to peter out. To renew interest, Christian had the book reprinted and began giving lectures in Boston. Both he and Charlie's mother, Sarah Ann, continued to search for their son until the day they passed away. Christian in 1897, and Sarah Ann in 1912. The couple followed copious amounts of leads, interviewed over 570 people, and spent approximately $60,000 searching for Charlie, hoping that one day they could bring him home. In 1924, to coincide with the 50th anniversary of when Charlie vanished, the local papers began reporting on the case again. By that time, Walter Ross was an adult and working as a stockbroker. He reported that he and his siblings continued to receive letters from men claiming to be their missing brother, and during their lifetime it was found that the siblings investigated around 1,000 impersonators. The most notable of these came from a man named Gustav Blair, who was a 69-year-old carpenter living in Phoenix, Arizona in 1934 when he came forward. He petitioned for the courts to recognize him as the real Charlie Ross, claiming that he'd been abducted as a child and lived in a cave for a time, before being adopted by a man who later told him in 1908 that he was the missing 4-year-old from Philadelphia and that he had kept him for the kidnappers. The Ross siblings were not happy about this, with Walter, exhausted from the years of con men attempting to get a slice of the family inheritance, labeling Blair a crank and saying that he found Blair's story to be unconvincing. He added later that he believed the idea of Charlie still being alive was absurd, stating, "We've long ago given up hope that Charlie would ever be found alive." Despite their unhappiness, the Ross family did not spend time contesting Blair's claims, and so the court ruled that he was Charles Brewster Ross. Even with this, Blair was never acknowledged by the family as their missing brother, and they did not leave him any money or property from their parents' estate. For a short while, Blair moved to LA and attempted to sell his life story to a movie studio, but this endeavor failed. He eventually moved to Germantown, then back to Phoenix with his wife. Blair died in December of 1943, aged 73, still claiming to be Charlie Ross. However, his descendants later took a DNA test, which conclusively proved he was not the missing child, but really a man named Nelson Miller. The fates of Westervelt, Mosher, and Douglas served as a deterrent to anyone who wished to kidnap for ransom. The next high-profile ransom case did not occur until 1900, when 16-year-old Edward Cuday Jr. was abducted while running errands. The case of Charlie Ross was what prompted the famous "don't take candy from strangers" notion, and the missing persons database, the Charlie Project, was named after him. Not only this, but as a result of the case, Pennsylvania later became the first state to pass a law changing kidnapping from a misdemeanor to a felony. The Ross family home was torn down in 1926, and Walter passed away in 1943. With him died perhaps the final chance of ever recovering Charlie. It is a curious case, as the identity of the kidnappers is known, but the location of Charlie has never been discovered, and even today, almost a century and a half later, his fate continues to elude authorities and his family. Louis Le Prince. Louis Le Prince was a French artist and inventor, famous for his creation of the early motion picture camera. He was the first person to shoot a moving picture sequence, utilizing a single lens camera and a strip of paper. Although many will cite the Lumiere brothers and Thomas Edison as the inventors of the motion picture, that's largely because Louis went missing just before he was due to publicly reveal his inventions. Louis was born in the city of Metz in France on August 28, 1841. His father was a major of artillery in the French army and was also an officer of the Légion d'honneur, a French order established in 1802. Louis spent much of his time in the studio belonging to his father's friend, a photographer who taught him about chemistry and photography, sparking his interest that would lead to his famous invention. As a result, Louis went on to study painting in Paris and postgraduate chemistry in Germany. In 1866, Louis left the country when he made the decision to move to Leeds, West Yorkshire, England, where a friend of his named John Whitley had invited him to join his engineering company. 3 years later, in 1869, Louis married John's sister Elizabeth, who was an artist. Together, the newlyweds shared their own educational establishment, the Leeds Technical School of Art, in 1871. Their techniques were unique and popular, affixing coloured photography onto metal and pottery. Several household names at the time, including Queen Victoria and Prime Minister William Gladstone, commissioned the couple for portraits in this unusual style. For a short while after opening the school, Louis spent some time managing French artists, and he began to build a 16-lens camera before returning home. In May of 1888, Louis built a single-lens camera, an updated version of what he used to shoot several motion picture films, the most notable of which is known as Round Hay Garden. He also shot several other films, including one of his son, Adolphe, playing the accordion, and one simply referred to as Leeds Bridge. In 1889 and 1890, he and a mechanic named James Longley attempted to create a projector so that the camera's images could be seen. According to family and friends, they had seen the projector in use, but the technology was never revealed to the public. In September of 1890, Louis began to prepare for his trip to the United States, where he'd premiere his work publicly. Before he departed for America, he went to see his brother, Albert, in Dijon. Little is known about Louis's time here, his mood, or what the siblings spoke about, but what we do know is that on September 16th, the 49-year-old boarded a train to Paris, but when it arrived, Louis was not on board, and neither was his luggage. It was suspected at first that he'd simply got on a later train, but he never reappeared, and was never seen again. French police, Scotland Yard, and family and friends all helped to search for the missing man, but he was never located, and there was no evidence or information to go on. Albert was the only witness to see Louis board the train, leading to theories that he was the one responsible and that he'd killed Louis and disposed of his body and belongings for financial gain. However, there is simply no evidence to back this theory up. Without any real leads, what we're left with is a number of theories. The grandson of Louis's brother allegedly told a film historian that the inventor wanted to take his own life because he was on the verge of bankruptcy. It's possible he arranged for his body and belongings to never be recovered. However, it's noted that Louis's business was very profitable and that he was proud of his inventions. It's likely he'd have come into money with the unveiling of his latest creations. As a result, it seems unlikely that he would wish to end his life for those reported money issues alone, although it could explain why neither his body nor his items ever resurfaced. Christopher Rowlands, the author of the 1990 book The Missing Reel, which discusses Louis's case, states the possibility that the 49-year-old was assassinated over patents. He claims that at the time of his vanishing, Louis was going to patent his projector in the UK, then leave Europe for his scheduled exhibition. Rowlands does not appear to be the only one who suspects this, as Louis's widow, Elizabeth, is said to believe that this was the end that her husband met. A Science Direct article from 2008 claims that a student at the University of New York found Thomas Edison's journal in the archives of the New York Library. A small entry from September 20th, 1890 read, quote, "Eric called me today from Dijon. It has been done. Prince is no more. This is good news, but I flinched when he told me. Murder is not my thing. I'm an inventor, and my inventions for moving images can now move forward." However, this note was authenticated by only one historian, so its legitimacy still remains questionable. In 1966, another theory suggested the idea that Louis had voluntarily disappeared due to financial reasons and familial inconveniences. A journalist claimed that in 1977 he had been shown a note which confirmed that Louis had passed away in Chicago in 1898, having moved there at the request of his family when it was revealed that he was a homosexual. However, as with all the theories, the evidence to support this is close to non-existent. The only other lead came from 2003, during research in the Paris police archives when a photo of a drowning victim was discovered. The man in the image is said to resemble Louis and was dated from 1890. However, nothing further appears to have come from this piece of potential evidence. Just 1 year after Louis' disappearance, Thomas Edison claimed the patent of inventing the motion picture with his kinetoscope invention. In 1898, Louis' eldest son, Adolf, who had helped in many of his father's experiments and even featured in one of his first motion pictures, went to court as a witness for the defense in a case which Edison had brought against the American Mutoscope Company. The company claimed that Louis was the first inventor of the motion picture camera and was so entitled to the royalties. They hoped that by citing Louis' achievements, they could stop Edison's claims in their tracks. Ultimately, the case went against the company, however, which was no surprise given how wealthy and well-established Edison was as an inventor. A year later, however, this ruling was overturned. Just 2 years after his court appearance, Adolf turned up dead from a gunshot wound on Fire Island in New York. It has never been made clear if he took his own life, if the shot had been accidental, or if someone else had pulled the trigger. His mother believed that he was executed in revenge for Adolf testifying in court against Edison. Louis was declared dead in 1897. Several different books, films, and documentaries have since been created about his bizarre case and his achievements. Several of his inventions are housed in Bradford's National Science and Media Museum, and multiple of his patents still remain. A BBC article from 2015 asked Laurie Snyder, Louis' great-great-granddaughter, what she thought of his disappearance. Snyder personally believes that Louis took a cab from the train station in Paris, having arrived at about 11 p.m. She thinks that the driver took advantage of the darkness and the fact that the inventor was alone and struck him across the head before throwing him in the Seine. Reportedly, 2 articles from the Times suggested that thieves were targeting lone travelers. Snyder says she can't believe that a man who loved his family so much, as evidenced by his letters, could willingly vanish or take his own life, and also adds that the idea of Albert executing his brother was absurd, as the family were famously very close. As for the Edison theory, Snyder believes that he probably had better things to do than pick off his rivals. Whatever the case may be, it seems likely that we will never know the truth about what happened to Louis Le Prince that night of September 16th, 1890. Crystal Lynn Beslanowicz. On December 4th, 1955, a young woman going by the name of Tracy Beslanowicz told her partner Chris that she was going for food at the local Circle K. However, when she didn't return home by 11 p.m, Chris began to worry. It wasn't like Tracy to not come home. She always let her boyfriend know where she was. Although he was concerned, Chris didn't immediately call the police. Instead, he knocked on the doors of neighbors and went down to Circle K himself to see if she was there. But there was no sign of Tracy. The next morning at 8:40 a.m, 45 miles away from Salt Lake City, a rancher and his son found the nude body of a young woman along the banks of the Provo River in Northfield, near Midway. The local police department was soon on the case. Very little evidence was found, but a pair of socks were located, neatly folded on a rock. The forensics team also collected several large bloody rocks from nearby, which they suspected to be the murder weapons. Since the body had no clothing and also no other belongings, including identification, authorities had a Jane Doe on their hands. However, they did have one advantage. The unidentified victim had several distinct tattoos, which they sketched out in the hopes that someone would come forward when they saw them on the news. The plan worked. Chris recognized the tattoos as belonging to his girlfriend Tracy, and he immediately contacted the authorities. However, all was not as it seemed. When police got in touch with Tracy's father, he revealed his suspicions that Jane Doe was not his daughter Tracy, but was his 17-year-old stepdaughter, Crystal, who had a habit of using her sister's identity. Crystal and Chris had been together for just over a year when they decided to start living together. The couple had been residing in a motel while they got the money together to find somewhere more permanent to live. Crystal's mother, Lindy Torson, said that her daughter had become involved with drugs and sex work, at the age of 15. She also added that, quote, "Every time Crystal came home, she had her arms spread out wide and a big smile on her face. I never refused her. I always loved her." As a result of this news, that the dead body wasn't that of Tracy but of Crystal, Chris became law enforcement's #1 suspect. After all, he was Crystal's boyfriend, who had identified her as Tracy. Very mysterious behaviour for an innocent man. But there was one problem. Chris lacked the motive and means to have carried out this horrific execution. Crystal was the breadwinner of the household, and she financially supported Chris. He also didn't have a car, so it seemed unlikely that he could have made the long-distance trip to where the dead woman was found. 3 days later, authorities thought they'd struck gold when they found out about a taxi driver named Herb Fry, who was well known for his infatuation with Crystal. He reportedly went as far as to tell people, "If I can't have her, nobody can." However, there was no evidence to link him to the crime either. Although the case grew cold as the years passed, investigators couldn't forget about Crystal. Todd Bonner, the detective who worked the case in the beginning, noted that it haunted him his entire career. By 2008, new techniques allowed forensic scientists to swab the rocks found by Crystal's body. As well as her DNA, the partial DNA of an unidentified male was also present on the murder weapons. It was not a match for Chris, nor was it a match to Herb Fry. Then, 5 years later in 2013, a new DNA tool became available. The MVAC was used on the rocks found at the scene, allowing authorities to pull a full DNA profile from them. Upon running the profile through CODIS, the police got a hit. The DNA belonged to Joseph Michael Simpson. Simpson was surveilled for a few days by law enforcement until he discarded a cigarette, which they used to definitively confirm that he was their offender. Todd Bonner, now county sheriff, tracked the perpetrator to Florida that same year to put the handcuffs on the killer himself. Simpson had a colourful history of crime, including several drug offences. However, the most notable thing is that he had been paroled just 8 months earlier, after serving time for murder. He'd been arrested in 1987 and spent 8 years behind bars for the crime. On September 29, 2016, Simpson was convicted of the murder of Crystal Beslanowicz. He was given life in prison without the chance for parole. Although nothing can erase the pain of losing a child and a sibling, at least justice was found, and the murderer who nearly got away with it is forever off the streets. Pamela Shelley. On January 6, 2001, at 5:15 p.m, Pamela Shelley was shot in the head in her bathroom. Her case was considered very open and shut, and almost immediately ruled as a suicide. At the time that Pam passed away, she was living with her boyfriend Ronnie Hendrick and her 2 children, Kayla, 12, and Dustin, 9. Originally from Arkansas, the mother of 2 was now living in a rural property in DeWitt County, Texas, 800 miles away from her home and her family. She was now just a mile away from Ronnie's family, having agreed to move to Texas with him in August of 2000. When Pam's suicide attempt was called in by Ronnie's father, she was still breathing. The ambulance that arrived came from outside the area and required directions to the nearest hospital. Ronnie was all too happy to oblige, leaving in the ambulance with Pamela just as the local police pulled up to investigate the scene. As a result, he couldn't be questioned, nor could they test him for gunshot residue. Law enforcement carried on with their job regardless, photographing the scene. A single slug and bloodstains were found on the floor, while the .32 caliber revolver Pam had used, along with its holster, were found on the bathroom counter. After combing through the scene, investigators turned to the Hendrick family, who were all present. They told officers that Pam was suicidal because she had to return to Arkansas, and they claimed she had to do this because her daughter was unhappy in Texas. They also added that there was a history of suicide in the mother of 2's family, and that her sister had killed herself in the years prior. They blamed 12-year-old Kayla in particular for her death, stating that she was a difficult child. Unbeknownst to the investigating officers, however, none of this was true. They were fed more lies upon questioning Ronnie, who said he was outside when he heard the shots. When he ran inside, he found his girlfriend on the floor. Once again, he reiterated the story of how Pam was upset and depressed about having to leave Texas. He explained that she would lose her children if she didn't return to her home state. Meanwhile, Pam died in San Antonio. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy quickly determined that the cause of death was suicide. The injury to her temple was consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. However, the police officers working the case were not entirely satisfied with this ruling, so they asked Ronnie Hendrick to come and take a polygraph test. He was scheduled for 2, but failed to show up on both occasions. It wasn't long before law enforcement realized that Ronnie had fled, and they struggled to locate him. The case grew cold and was eventually closed, until 2008 when it was finally reopened. Around this time, Ronnie reappeared in DeWitt County. He was in jail on domestic abuse charges. An officer found that he'd been living in South Dakota since Pam's death. He was finally given a polygraph test in relation to his ex-girlfriend's case, and failed. However, we must recognize that polygraph tests are famously unreliable. Still, this negative result may have played a role in Ronnie's behavior, as during further questioning, he finally admitted to 4 witnesses that he had not been outside when Pam took her life. In fact, he had been in the room with her. 4 years later, in 2012, law enforcement attempted to bring attention to the case by working with a new TV show called Cold Justice. During the crew's research for the episode, no new forensics were uncovered. However, plenty of other information was. Firstly, Pam's family had no history of suicide or depression. They also found out that Ronnie Hendrick had a pattern of both alcohol and domestic abuse, and that he had, at one time, nearly killed a former girlfriend. The most revealing piece of information, however, was found when Pam's ex-husband, Jesse, was tracked down. He told authorities that on the day of her passing, Pam was due to come home to Arkansas, and the couple were going to reunite and try to be a family again, as he was Kayla's biological father. He explained that while on the phone with Pam, Ronnie grabbed it from her and told Jesse the only way his girlfriend would be coming back to Arkansas was in a pine box. We have no answer as to why Jesse did not come forward sooner with this information, although it is speculated that because of his multiple run-ins with the law, he was incarcerated at the time of his interview with police, that he had grown distrustful of authorities and did not believe in reaching out to them. Ronnie Hendrick, 41 at the time, was indicted in 2012. However, there was one final hitch with the solving of Pam's case. As Cold Justice aired nationwide before the trial was due to start, it became very difficult for the authorities to garner a non-biased jury, leading to an eventual mistrial. However, all was not lost. Ronnie subsequently entered a guilty plea in exchange for 22 years behind bars. Christy Mirack. 25-year-old Christy Mirack was a popular schoolteacher living in Pennsylvania in 1992. Born in Pennsylvania in 1967, Christy Mirack had graduated from high school in 1985 and gone on to become a teacher. She had recently moved to Lancaster and taken a job teaching 6th grade children, where she excelled due to her kind, caring attitude. Although she was particularly close to her mother, Christy was very private about her life outside of work. As a result, not much information on her life outside of the school is known to the public. On December 21st, 1992, always punctual Christy failed to show up for work, causing her colleagues and boss to grow concerned. Knowing that this was extremely out of character for the 25-year-old, the principal of the school drove to her apartment complex. Suspiciously, the door was ajar, so Christy's boss peered in. What he found inside was a scene which horrified him, and he fled to another building to call the authorities. When police arrived, they quickly learned about Christy's steadfast devotion to her door and window locks. She was an extremely cautious person who always made sure everything was locked up tight before bed. She did the same when she left the house, making it extremely unusual that her door was ajar. From this, authorities deduced that the 25-year-old must have been either surprised by her attacker as she left her home, or knew the person and let them through. Christy did not live alone. She did have a roommate who'd left just before 7 that morning. As Christy herself usually left around 7:45, that left a very small window in which she had been attacked. There had clearly been a struggle inside the apartment. Gift parcels and bags were strewn all over the floor. The 25-year-old's end had been brutally violent. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her own sweater, her clothing in disarray. She had also suffered blunt force trauma, her face littered with bruising, and she had a fractured jaw. The perpetrator's DNA was taken from Christy's body and from underneath it, but provided no new leads. While the school's principal was, of course, considered a suspect initially, he was quickly ruled out, as was an old boyfriend of Christy's who was married and 20 years her senior. Multiple witnesses provided the description of a man driving either a white 1993 Dodge Shadow convertible or a 1990s ES, or possibly a Toyota. Following this, several different descriptions, sketches, and car information was released to the public over the following months. The police were clearly trying, but it seems difficult for them to pin down what information was the most accurate from what they'd been given. For years, police believed that she had been slain by somebody that she knew. 60 men were looked into and dismissed via DNA testing, and 1,600 people were interviewed in total in Christy's case. But everything was a dead end. Then in 2003, a local newspaper received a strange call from a suspicious man who mentioned Christy's alleged double life and promiscuous behavior. However, by the time the FBI was contacted, it was too late to run a trace to locate the caller. Fast forward to 2017, where new profiles of the killer were made, utilizing his DNA from the crime scene. A year later, this DNA was uploaded to GEDmatch, a genealogy website, and investigators working Christy's case finally got a hit on a man named Raymond Rowe, a local beloved DJ who went by the name of DJ Freeze. His sibling had uploaded their DNA to the website, leading to the hit. Much like the case of Crystal Beslanowicz, investigators in Christy's case observed her suspected killer before obtaining his DNA. It conclusively matched that which was taken from Christy's crime scene. Authorities also discovered that the man had driven a white Toyota Coupe at the time of the slaying. Born in 1968, Raymond Rowe had been divorced 3 times and, disturbingly, actually held an anti-violence rally the same year he had murdered Christy. Rowe was arrested in June of 2018. At the time, he was married to his 4th wife, a Ukrainian woman with a child from a previous relationship. Upon being arrested, Rowe admitted guilt and offered an apology to Christy's remaining family. Her mother had passed away sometime prior to the capture of Rowe. He told the family, simply, "I can't imagine what you're going through. I apologize." Despite admitting to the crime, Rowe offered no version of events, nor did he explain why he carried out such a horrific deed. It remains unknown how he knew Christy, although a ticket stub found in her apartment at the time indicates that she visited the club where Rowe worked as a DJ in 1992, but it is unclear whether the pair actually knew each other or not. After his arrest, one of his ex-wives came forward to state that at the time of Christy's execution, the couple had read the headlines together in shock. She noted that Rowe had expressed concern for her safety, knowing there was a killer on the loose. While Rowe escaped the death sentence, he will be in prison for the rest of his life. Authorities are uncertain if this was Rowe's only crime. For many, given the unforgiven brutality of Christy's slaying, it seems unlikely that it was simply a one-off act. Despite his lifelong imprisonment, Christy's family have noted that Rowe was still free of consequences for longer than their beloved sister and daughter was even alive. Despite this, Roe was just another criminal who couldn't run forever. Another who thought they'd gotten away with it before justice finally caught up with him. Lila Portress. The story of 28-year-old Lila Portress starts on June 27th, 1977, when she was last seen at her home on Cynthia Avenue in Tiverton, Rhode Island. An employee of an insurance company in Fall River, Massachusetts, she did not show up to her work for several days, and her car remained in her drive for an unusually long time. 2 days later, on June 29th, a suspicious neighbor asked her husband to check on the young woman. Her front door was locked, but notably, her porch light was on, even though it was the middle of the day. Still concerned for her safety, her neighbors alerted the local police department. Inside, Lila's TV was on, as were all her lights. Her pet cat appeared to be home alone. Police found her purse, ID, glasses, and contact lenses, causing them to suspect that she'd fallen victim to foul play. There were no signs of a struggle, so they worked on the theory that she left with someone she knew, with the intention of returning home. The only thing missing from the house was a set of spare keys. A few weeks later, on July 13th, 1977, workers found the 28-year-old's body in a wooded area near William S. Canning Boulevard in Fall River, Massachusetts. She was specifically located in a thick underbrush, around 40 feet from the road. The route between her house and the woods was only about 3 miles long. Lila had been shot to death with a small caliber weapon, like that which is often used in hits or execution-style killings. Authorities determined that she had been killed elsewhere and then dumped in the woods. Lila was found fully clothed, but it could not be determined whether or not she was sexually assaulted due to the state of decomposition. The spare set of keys which were missing from the home were found on her person. When the case went public, a neighbor came forward to state that they heard screams emanating from her house at around 3 a.m. on the night of the 27th. Investigators also discovered that the last person to see her alive was her boyfriend, who claimed that he had left the house at around 12 a.m. that night. Over the next year, the police and FBI followed up hundreds of leads and interviewed over 100 people. Several persons of interest were identified, but no one was ever charged in relation to Lila's slaying. Given that her case received tragically little media coverage, there isn't much known about the investigation following her demise, nor her background. What we do know for certain is that Lila moved to Rhode Island in 1972 after marrying a man named William J. Souza. The couple bought a house together, but divorced 3 years later. At the time of her passing, Lila had plans to take time off work and head to her home state of Maine, where her father still lived, working as an engineer. There are many wild theories being speculated upon in relation to Lila's case, although most of them cannot be substantiated. According to local gossip, there was a rumor among the 28-year-old's co-workers that she was having an affair with a police officer. It is unknown whether any officers were questioned in relation to the case, or whether there is any truth at all to this allegation. It's also been suggested that perhaps Lila stumbled across something suspicious at her job, while others have pointed to the tidy way in which she was executed and dumped. This, combined with the small weapon caliber, have made many wonder if she was subject to some kind of hit. However, Lila was described as an extrovert with lots of friends and a passion for stray animals. It seems extremely odd to think that she could have become muddled up in some criminal activity, although it isn't out of the realm of possibility. In 2019, Lila's case was featured on a pack of cold case playing cards that were distributed to prisons nationwide. Her case, now over 4 decades old, still goes unsolved, although detectives working the case say they are close to finding an answer. Anyone with any information on Lila's case can contact the Riverton PD at 401-625-6717. Michelle Norris. On May 26, 1988, 7-year-old Michelle Norris went to the playground of Captain G. Harold Hunt Elementary School in Central Falls, Rhode Island. She attended first grade there and wanted to go and play with her brothers. Her mother, Julia, stayed behind to rest due to a kidney infection she was suffering from at the time. Following their parents' separation, the children were staying with their mother at their grandmother's house. One of the windows of the home looked straight out onto the playground. Before she left, Michelle asked her mother if she wanted any Tylenol, but Julia told her she was fine. The 7-year-old told her mother she loved her, said goodbye, and left. This was the last time Julia ever saw her daughter. At the playground, none of Michelle's brothers saw anything suspicious. According to Julia, her daughter wouldn't go off with a stranger without a fight. She believes that whoever took Michelle must have been someone she was familiar with. She was last seen between 6 and 7 p.m. that evening. Naturally, a search party immediately formed, but it wouldn't be for a few days until volunteer searchers found the 7-year-old deceased and unclothed less than half a mile from where she was last seen, on the side of the hill behind the dance hall on Brook Street. Her pink t-shirt and purple shorts were neatly folded next to her body. The area had been searched just the day prior by her father, William. Medical examiner Kristen Sweeney performed the autopsy and discovered that Michelle's end was violent. She had been beaten and sexually assaulted before being forced into the soil and suffocated. Her body sported numerous cuts and bruises, which she had sustained from trying to fight off her abuser. Forensic testing, however, found that the soil Michelle had inhaled did not match that of the dump site, suggesting that she had been slain elsewhere. This vile attack on a little girl sent shockwaves throughout the city. Parents held their children tighter and became wary of letting them out of their sight. Although several people were questioned during the initial investigation into Michelle's demise, leads were quick to dry up. Several years later, the police chief of Central Falls at the time told a reporter with Providence Journal that he believed a local resident was responsible for the abduction and homicide. This unnamed suspect has never been taken into custody, however, due to a lack of evidence. It has baffled investigators and online sleuths alike that Michelle did not scream or run away, adding credence to the thought that she must have known whoever took her. However, it still seems unusual there were no witnesses to the crime or its aftermath. Did the abductor live nearby? How did they get away from the playground with Michelle? There are so many questions and so few answers. There is one publicly known suspect in the case. He is possibly the one who investigators are interested in. According to the investigation discovery show Breaking Homicide, Michelle's best friend's stepdad faced criminal charges for molesting his stepdaughter. He reportedly lived within blocks of the playground. However, he has never been charged with Michelle's abduction. Like Lila's case in recent years, Michelle's slaying has been featured on playing cards distributed to prisoners. Investigators hope that it will bring the break in the case that they need. Her mother, Julia, now lives in Massachusetts and has 7 grandchildren. After Michelle's passing, the Children's Friend and Service Agency in Rhode Island set up the Michelle Norris Memorial Reward to remember her. It's awarded each year to an individual or organization that provides extraordinary support and assistance in improving the futures of the state's most vulnerable children. Sadly, Michelle's case has largely gone cold in recent years. If you have any information, you can contact the Rhode Island State Police at 401-444-1046. Mary Moroney. Born May 9th, 1928, Mary Agnes Moroney was the light of her parents' life. Michael and Catherine Moroney married young. Catherine was 13, and by the time she was 17, the couple had 2 daughters, Mary, who was 2, and Anastasia, who was 11 months. The couple lived at 5200 Wentworth Avenue in Chicago, Illinois, and were very poor. Michael made around $15 a week, which is the modern equivalent of around $224 today. A relative of Catherine's wrote to the Needy Family Services, a newspaper column in which people could request financial assistance, and a paragraph documenting their plight was printed. The service didn't normally print addresses, but due to a mistake, the address of the couple was learned by a woman who decided to use this opportunity to her advantage. On May 14, 1930, an unidentified woman came to the door of the family home. There are two variations commonly reported about what exactly the woman told Catherine. The first is that she was a social worker who'd been sent to examine their case, while the other was that she'd been sent on behalf of a social worker named Mrs. Henderson. She was described as a well-dressed young woman around the age of 22 with protruding teeth and a cultured voice. She claimed that her name was Julia Otis, and she provided the couple with some basic groceries free of charge. After listening to the couple's problems, Julia asked if she could take Mary away with her to California on a temporary basis. She explained that on her return, Mary would be unrecognizable and, quote, fat as a butterball. Catherine refused the offer, however. Julia left the couple $12 and promised to return. Right on cue, the following day, Julia came back. This time she had baby clothes, as Catherine was 7 months pregnant with the couple's third child. The young woman said she'd arranged for Michael to get a better job, and this time offered to take Mary shopping for clothes and shoes at a nearby store. Eventually, Catherine agreed. Mary reportedly cried and refused to go, but was taken anyway. Neither Mary nor Julia Otis ever came back. The next day, the Moroneys received a letter from the mysterious woman. It read as follows. Please don't be alarmed. I have taken your little girl to California with me. I have hired a special nurse to care for her. We'll be back in 2 months. By that time, you will be on your feet again and will be able to care for her. She didn't even cry a bit. She's outfitted like a princess. In the meantime, I'll help all I can to get you on your feet. Don't worry about her or anything else. When you get this letter, we'll be on our way already. As ever, Julia Otis. The letter was written on stationery from a Chicago store, and witnesses believed they saw Julia with Mary as she dictated the note to a store employee. She also apparently paid for Mary's clothing with a $50 note, which was a lot of money during this time period. This has led to much online speculation that she was a member of a black market adoption ring. The letter did not help put the couple at ease, and despite the promises that Julia made, Michael and Catherine never saw their eldest daughter again. This was also the last time Julia ever contacted the family, and she did nothing to provide them with further aid. 2 weeks later, a woman named Alice Henderson sent a letter to the couple claiming that Julia was her cousin, and she was love-hungry from losing her husband and baby the year before. She added that their baby would be returned to them, safe and sound. However, as with Julia, Alice was never heard from again. Authorities noted that both of the letter writers shared the same handwriting. Leads in the investigation were sparse. In July of 1931, an elderly Native American woman named Martha Thompson was found pushing a cart which contained a blonde-haired, blue-eyed 3-year-old girl matching Mary's description. Martha claimed that the girl was abandoned by her mother, a woman named Florence Fuller, and begged to be allowed to keep her. Although investigators were initially optimistic, the Moroneys did not identify the little girl as their missing daughter. Then, in 1952, a 24-year-old housewife from California came forward believing that she could be the missing Moroney child, as her husband had noticed similarities between the two. Mary McClelland had been adopted by Charles and Nova Beck in 1930. She had similar teeth, body and skull measurements, blood type and prints to the Moroneys, but she had no scar from an operation that Mary had received when she was younger. The reunion between Mary and her possible family was highly publicized. Catherine and Michael accepted her as theirs, but testing carried out after Mary passed away in 2005 proved that she wasn't Mary Moroney. Michael and Catherine Moroney went on to have 6 more children after Mary's disappearance, 1 sister and 5 brothers, but nothing could fill the void that their first child left behind. It's been 90 years since Mary Moroney went missing, and her whereabouts still remain unknown. Although it seems unlikely that we will ever see a resolution to this case, we must hold out hope that one day a small piece of evidence will be found that will shed light on the mystery of Mary Moroney. The Twitter Killer. For those familiar with Takahiro Shiraishi, he was the last person anyone would suspect of being a serial killer. Described as quiet but sociable, an attentive student, and as somebody who liked sports, Takahiro enjoyed a good relationship with his father and lived a seemingly ordinary life. After graduating from school, the young man went on to work in a supermarket for several years, but failing to enjoy it, quit and looked elsewhere. From here, Takahiro became a scout who recruited women for the sex work industry. Around this time, things began to fall apart. People began to warn each other about Takahiro, who was described as a, quote, creepy scout. He was eventually arrested for his scouting work and was given a suspended jail sentence. At some point in 2017, Takahiro told his father that his life had no meaning. In March of that year, he opened up a Twitter account to, according to prosecutors, contact women contemplating suicide, who he saw as easy targets. In August, the young man moved to Zama, 25 miles southwest of Tokyo, and rented an apartment there. Using his Twitter account, Takahiro told his victims that he could help them die, and in some cases, he even told them he would take his own life alongside them. His crimes came to light in October of 2017, when law enforcement was tipped off during a missing persons investigation. The brother of one of Takehiro's victims found messages from his Twitter account and asked a female friend of his to set up a meeting with the man on the other end of the account. However, Takahiro was not met with another victim, but instead confronted by the police. He told them that the corpse of the girl they were looking for was stored in his freezer. Authorities uncovered the body parts of 9 victims in cooler boxes and other storage containers in Takehiro's own apartment. He had even discarded some parts into the apartment block's recycling bin. Neighbors of the young man later told reporters that while they'd noticed foul smells emanating from the home, they hadn't reported it. Takahiro later told police, and I quote, "I killed them all and did some work on the bodies in order to hide the evidence." The gruesome, grisly crimes became a high-profile case in the Japanese media, sending shockwaves throughout the country. Earlier this year, 2020, aged 29, Takahiro stood trial. While his defense lawyers claimed that he should face a more lenient sentence because he had had the consent of the victims before taking their lives, Takahiro publicly disagreed with them, stating, "There were bruises on the back of the victims' heads. It means there was no consent, and I did it so they wouldn't resist." As the trial went on, more information about Takehiro's activities came to light. Reportedly, the then 27-year-old would invite his victims back to his apartment, where he would sexually assault and strangle them before dismembering their bodies. Of his victims, Takahiro executed 8 females and 1 male. The male was a boyfriend of one of the victims who'd come to confront Takahiro about his missing partner. 3 of the victims were still in high school, with one of them being just 15 years old. Reportedly, the motive behind these heinous crimes was sex. Takahiro wished to carry out sexual assault fantasies without worrying about them denying his advances, or being concerned with the repercussions. A friend from high school later indicated that the young man enjoyed choking others, although one former girlfriend of his said he was gentle and never angry. Currently, Takehiro's case is still ongoing. If convicted for murder, he'll likely face the death sentence, but if he is charged with murder with consent, he's more likely to face jail time for up to 7 years. His sentencing is expected to be carried out before the end of 2020. His disturbing and awful case has led him to be dubbed the Twitter Killer, and his crimes have been likened to that of the suicide website murderer who killed 3 people in Japan in 2005. Takehiro's crime spree also resulted in Twitter introducing new rules against promoting suicide and self-harm. If you or anyone you know is struggling with either of these issues, please seek help. You deserve to be happy. It is always worth fighting for. David Russell and Maricar Benedicto. David Russell is almost certainly a name you are unfamiliar with. Despite the horrific and terrifying nature of his crime, the case was not widely covered in his native Great Britain, and as a result, is rarely spoken about outside of it. On April 1st, 2011, 20-year-old David Russell, who was, at the time, an employee at McDonald's, met up with Maricar Benedicto, a 19-year-old from California who'd flown out to meet him. The pair had been engaged in an online relationship since 2010, with both of them using pseudonyms which illustrated their shared love of heavy metal music. David went by the name of Ollie Sykes, after the frontman of Sheffield-based Bring Me the Horizon, a metal band, while Maricar went by Ruby Townsend. The couple were well aware of each other's aliases, and reportedly even spoken on Skype before they finally decided to meet up. At some point, however, before Maricar flew back to the UK, she found out that David had been leading a double life. He apparently already had a girlfriend, whom she messaged to let her know that the pair had met on Facebook and were continuing to talk there. It's unknown if this is what ultimately sparked what happened between the couple when they met in person. Upon meeting in Northampton, David took Maricar to the Harlestone Firs forest. According to prosecutors, he had her sit down on a fallen tree trunk and said he'd blindfold her so that he could give her a surprise present. After blindfolding the 19-year-old, David asked her to put her head back and her arms up. She did so, fully trusting him. Then David stepped forward and slit her neck. The 2-inch wound was not enough to immediately kill her, so she attempted to run, pulling the blindfold off. David gave chase and shouted at her, "Why won't you die?" When he caught her, he stabbed her in the back. Reportedly, the 20-year-old Brit stabbed his victim 3 more times, hit her in the face with a log, and even headbutted her. David only stopped attacking Maricar when she told him she'd given his name and address to immigration upon her arrival. The pair parted ways after this. David went home, where he was found later collapsed on the floor from a suspected overdose, while Maricar had gone to a nearby home for help. Luckily, she survived the wounds that had been inflicted upon her. David attempted to spin a story in which he claimed the 19-year-old had been blackmailing him, and that he had intended to scare her by scratching her neck. But in the end, no jury he faced was convinced by this story. According to the prosecution, the day before Maricar arrived in the UK, David had searched the web for several disturbing and incriminating things, including how to cut skin with a knife, the best knife to kill, and how to kill someone with your bare hands. A serrated bread knife was his weapon of choice and had been found in his home with him. A deleted list was also recovered from his mobile phone that contained the words bin bag, knife, gloves, blindfold, and money. It appeared to be an open and shut case. David's defense lawyers argued, however, that he was a good man. They described him as a hard-working individual who'd otherwise never done anything wrong, and stated that while he was young and troubled, his actions would never be repeated. It was also said that he was, quote, borderline autistic, although their basis for this is unclear. In October of 2011, at Northampton Crown Court, David Russell was sentenced to a minimum of 17.5 years in prison. But this conviction was later quashed, after he appealed on the grounds of the legal advice he'd received at the time. In 2016, a new trial began. During it, his defense pointed out that he didn't kill Maricar or inflict a single life-changing injury, despite the fact that she almost certainly endured painful psychological trauma following the attack. They added that she had not survived because of intervention, but because he had stopped what he was doing and walked away, and that David was not a man who was violent by nature. The jury did not believe this, however, and took less than 2 hours to find him guilty of attempted murder in September that year. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison and 7 years on license. Gary Newman and Carly Ryan. In 2007, Carly Ryan was an ordinary 14-year-old girl living in Stirling, South Australia, with her mother. Described as a sensitive and loving girl, in the 18 months leading up to her demise, Carly had begun speaking with a boy online, using the sites MySpace and VampireFreaks.com to communicate with him. By all accounts, she had fallen head over heels for an 18-year-old musician named Brandon Kane, who was an American teen living in Melbourne. By January of 2007, the couple's romance had blossomed into not just an online relationship, but one that also took place over the telephone. That month, a serial paedophile named Gary Francis Newman travelled to Stirling from Melbourne, under the guise of being Brandon's father. He called himself Shane and met up with Carly to present her with inappropriate gifts, which included lingerie and a nurse's outfit. He even met with her mother, Sonia, who allowed him to stay overnight and attend Carly's 15th birthday party. However, things quickly disintegrated when the 50-year-old man began to act erratically and made advances on the young girl, leading to Sonia kicking him out of the house. Afterwards, the concerned mother limited the time Carly could spend on her phone. Unfortunately, that is not where the story ends. On February 19th, Carly left the house to head to a friend's for a sleepover, but she didn't come home the next day. A terrified Sonia quickly alerted police, who discovered the 15-year-old's body at Horseshoe Bay in Port Elliot, face down in the shallow water, unresponsive. Emergency responders failed to revive Carly. She had endured 19 separate injuries, including between 6 to 8 blows to the head. Her cause of death was reportedly a combination of facial trauma, smothering, and drowning. The police did not waste any time in their investigation. CCTV footage of the area showed Carly on February 19th with 2 males. Witnesses last saw her alive at 9:30 that night. Luckily, the perpetrators had used a distinct pale blue vehicle, which authorities traced to Mornington. 11 days after Carly's demise, a raid led to the arrest of Gary Newman and the detention of his adopted son, who was a minor at the time. A search of the home turned up a notebook in which Newman detailed over 200 online personas, as well as other attempts at grooming in Australia and beyond. Carly was not his first victim. A young girl in Singapore was threatened by Newman when he told her that she'd be left, and I quote, looking like the packaged meat from a supermarket after she rejected him. At the time of his arrest, the 50-year-old had been chatting online with another 14-year-old. It is believed that the motivation behind the crime was that Carly had rejected Newman's advances when he'd visited her. During his trial, the older man behaved erratically and initially denied ever knowing or meeting Carly. His identity was also suppressed for some time. In March of 2010, however, he was sentenced to life in prison with a 29-year non-parole period. Newman's adopted son, who had witnessed the killing, was cleared of all charges. To this day, his identity remains suppressed. Carly Ryan's case serves as a cautionary tale to young people and their parents. It was the first crime of its sort and led to online users and parents of online users becoming more aware of the dangers of the internet in the modern age. Several laws have since been passed in areas of Australia to help protect children while they're online. The Carly Ryan Foundation was also set up by Sonia after the trial was finished. This non-profit charity aims to promote internet safety to children, parents, and teachers alike. The organization hopes that they can prevent any more children meeting the same fate that Carly did back in 2007. The Tanaku Exorcism. In January of 2005, Maricar Komichi, a 23-year-old woman, moved to the Tanaku Monastery, located in the isolated village of Tanaku, which consisted of around 1,000 people and was made up of hills and vineyards. Left as an orphan when her father committed suicide, Maricar and her brother had not had an easy upbringing, but the young woman was trying to keep on the right path. As a 19-year-old, she had worked as a nanny in Germany before going on to work in Romania. But when a friend of hers joined a monastery and recommended that she too join, Maricar decided that it was time for a career change. Soon after joining, however, things started to go downhill for the 23-year-old. She began giggling during Mass, and by April her mental state had severely deteriorated. Her friends and family noted that prior to this massive shift, she had not shown any signs of mental health problems. Upon being taken to a psychiatric hospital, however, Maricar was diagnosed as schizophrenic. She spent only 2 weeks in the hospital before being released into the care of the monastery. Daniel Peter Corriganou was the 29-year-old priest of the monastery at this time. As a teenager, Daniel had been a football player, but he wasn't able to get into his desired university to study law or sports, and so he began religious studies elsewhere. A year into his education, he was recruited by a wealthy businessman who wanted him to help build a monastery. He was ordained by a local bishop and was expected to return to his learning once the building was complete, but instead, he gave up on university so he could devote his life to running the Tanaku Monastery. After learning about Maricar, Daniel came to believe that the 23-year-old was not mentally ill, but was possessed by Satan. He claimed that pills wouldn't remove the devil, and that an exorcism was wholly necessary. Daniel was seemingly not alone in believing this. Maricar's brother claimed he had witnessed Satan go into her. Several nuns bound Maricar's hands and feet, locking her in a room. They later claimed this was to stop her from hurting herself due to her violent movements. The nuns then left the young woman alone and went to celebrate Christ's ascension into heaven, gathering in the church. A few days later, they chained Maricar to a cross with her arms stretched out and carried her into the church so they could anoint her. According to one of the nuns, Maricar was restrained like any victim of demonic possession would be, and that if she had not been fastened down, she could have, quote, killed others or herself. This same nun alleged that Maricar knew she was possessed because she begged to be tied up, and the nuns simply helped. The 23-year-old then had her wrists and foreheads anointed with holy oil, and a towel was placed in her mouth to stop her from cursing. Daniel and the nuns prayed to cast out the devil, wetting her lips with holy water. In one statement later given by Daniel, Maricar remained like this for 5 days, although the majority of reports on the case report that she was kept locked up in the church for 3 days. From here, the young woman was moved to her room and untied, where Daniel declared her cured. She was given bread and tea before fainting. When the nuns of the monastery couldn't rouse Maricar, they checked her pulse to find that it was weak, and so they called an ambulance. During the ambulance ride, paramedics administered 6 doses of adrenaline, but their efforts failed. Maricar died before they reached the hospital. Several doctors who noticed the marks left on the 23-year-old's body notified authorities, which led to the arrest of 4 nuns who participated in the exorcism, as well as Daniel. According to Maricar's initial autopsy, she passed away from dehydration, exhaustion, and a lack of oxygen. As a result, Daniel and the nuns were charged with murder and depriving a person of liberty. Daniel was defrocked after being convicted. Prosecutors sought for the priest to be given 25 years. He was originally sentenced to 14, but the Court of Appeals reduced this to 7. He was freed on parole in November of 2011, having served 2/3 of this sentence. The other nuns received around 5 years each, although it is unlikely they served their full time either. According to news articles, as Maricar was lowered into her grave at her funeral, thunder was heard. Daniel concluded from this that the will of God had been done. During his hearing, he admitted that he had taped over her mouth during Mass so she could not disturb the service. Although many of Daniel's followers were furious upon hearing his sentencing, the local community was understandably shocked and appalled by the case. Several articles from 2014 have claimed that, upon attempting to return to Tanaku to build a new monastery in Maricar's name, the former priest was chased out of the area by locals, making it evident that he was not welcome in their village. The same year, it was made public that a new cause of death had been established, and that Maricar had passed away from an overdose of adrenaline that was administered by the ambulance crew. According to Daniel, this cause of death had been established much earlier, but had been discounted by the courts. Despite this, many continued to hold Daniel and the nuns responsible for the needless torture and death of a young woman. Maricar's case has inspired several books, as well as the 2017 movie, The Crucifixion. Roland Doe. Born in 1935, the boy Roland Doe, or Robbie as he is also referred to as, was the subject of one of America's most bizarre exorcism cases. This name, Roland Doe, is a pseudonym, as the boy's true identity remains unknown. Roland was born into a German Lutheran family and lived in Cottage City, Maryland in 1949. An only child, Roland repeatedly relied on his family to be his friends and playmates and was particularly close with his Aunt Harriet, a woman who was a spiritualist. When the young boy expressed interest in her Ouija board, she introduced him to it. However, Harriet soon passed away, and after her death, Roland's family began to experience bizarre anomalies. They heard strange noises, witnessed furniture moving, and even saw objects floating when Roland was nearby. The young boy himself even began acting strangely. He would be quiet and calm during the day, but after settling into bed, he would scream and subject his family to wild, uncontrollable outbursts. Terrified of what was happening, Roland's family turned to their Lutheran pastor, a man named Luther Miles Schulz, for help. He arranged for the 14-year-old to spend the night with him so that he could observe him, and later claimed to have witnessed objects moving by themselves. The following day, he recommended that the family take Roland to see a Catholic priest. According to the story, Roland then underwent a series of exorcisms, led by a Roman Catholic priest named Edward Hughes. The process took place at Georgetown University Hospital. Reportedly, during one of these exorcisms, Roland slipped one of his hands from the restraints holding him down, broke a bed spring from under the mattress, and used it as a makeshift weapon, slashing Hughes's arm and promptly ending the procedure. However, despite these accounts of Roland at Georgetown University, recent investigations have revealed little evidence to support this part of Roland's story. What we do know for certain is that the family travelled to St. Louis, where Roland had a cousin. The cousin had previously contacted one of his professors at the St. Louis University, a man named Raymond Bishop, who in turn spoke to William Bowden, an associate of the college church. Both priests went to visit Roland at the home of his extended family. Once again, they allegedly saw flying objects, a shaking bed, and the young boy speaking to them in a guttural voice and exhibiting an aversion to anything sacred. As a result, another exorcism was arranged to take place in South St. Louis at the Alexian Brothers Hospital. Knowing Roland's backstory, the men realized that this could be dangerous and took on the assistance of two more priests, one named Walter Halloran, who was 26 at the time, and another named William Van Roo. According to Halloran, the words evil and hell appeared on Roland's body, along with various red marks such as an X on his chest, a pitchfork shape on his thigh, and several lines that led from the top of his legs down to his ankles. The mattress Roland was on began to shake yet again. He reportedly even had seizures. During the procedure, the priests laid crucifixes and rosaries on his body. At one point during the process, the 14-year-old allegedly broke Halloran's nose, although it's unknown how exactly he did this. Roland was said to have been possessed by at least 10 demons, and this final exorcism finally expelled them from his body. Afterwards, the young boy appeared to have no memory of the events that had taken place during the time he was possessed, and went on to lead a very normal life. Raymond Bishop and William Bowden were both so convinced by his possession that they recorded all the events in their diaries. These sources, along with the account of Pastor Schulz, were what led to the story being covered in local papers at the time. If this is beginning to sound familiar, it's because the story of Roland Doe went on to inspire the 1971 novel The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, which then led to the creation of the well-known and beloved supernatural horror film of the same name. According to author Thomas Allen, Father Walter Halloran was the last surviving eyewitness to this series of exorcisms, which, according to one account, was witnessed by 48 people, although the diaries of the priests involved seem to disagree with this. Halloran passed away in 2005. Thomas Allen went on to claim that he had uncovered Roland Doe's true identity, but has said he will never reveal it. According to some reports, Walter Halloran was also the only priest involved to have had his doubts about the young boy's possession. Many modern-day theories conclude that nothing supernatural ever happened, while another author has proposed the idea that Roland was a disturbed child who simply threw tantrums to get attention. This same author claims that Walter Halloran said he never heard the young boy's voice change, and that he often mimicked the Latin words spoken by priests. He was not suddenly fluent in the language. The priests also failed to check Roland's fingernails to determine whether or not the injuries to his body had been made himself. The author also added that, after interviewing childhood friends and neighbours, he concluded that Roland was a very clever trickster who would pull pranks to frighten his mother and fool the neighbourhood children. The man believed to be Roland Doe was tracked down by a writer several years ago. He did not confirm nor deny his identity, but made it clear he was not interested in being interviewed. As of 2013, he was alive and well, aged in his 70s. The home where he stayed in St. Louis is still frequented by tourists who are familiar with the incredible story. Joanna Lee. Born sometime in 1963 in South Korea, very little is known about the early life of Joanna Lee. Some sources have stated that she was an orphan, while others have claimed that her parents were divorced. Either way, when the 37-year-old passed away at the hands of her pastor, nobody was there to claim her body. Pastor Luke Lee originally arrived in New Zealand in 1994. Also from South Korea, he was described as a man with strong convictions. After some shady business dealings, Luke left his wife and children behind and headed for Auckland, New Zealand, where he studied at the Assemblies of God Advanced Ministry of Training Centre. In 1996, he married another Korean woman named Joyce Lee. The couple later had a daughter together. After his training, Luke went on to preach in South London for 6 months before returning to Korea. While there, he was imprisoned for a year for fraud. When he returned to New Zealand, he founded the Lord of All Church in Mount Roskill, where he led 20 followers, most of whom were Korean. Not much is documented about this church, which is often referred to as a cult, but reportedly some of the strange rituals included fasting, squealing, and washing cut hair in alcohol. Joanna first met Pastor Luke Lee, who was not related to her, in South Korea in 1999. She was so taken with him that she decided to follow him to Auckland to join his church in October of 2000. On the 9th of December that year, Joanna allegedly told Luke that demons were killing her. He then suggested to her that they attempt to exorcise these demons, and claimed that she was possessed by at least 20 of them. He said they would not leave her body until she died, but that afterwards, he claimed that she could be brought back to life. The exorcism began on December 10th. Over the next 6 hours, Luke sat on Joanna's chest and abdomen, bouncing on her body and breaking several bones as a result. Luke thought that he had to expel the demons by pushing them up from her stomach, so when they apparently reached her throat, he began to strangle the 37-year-old woman with his hands. The details that were given by Luke's followers in court, however, described the horrific scene in more detail. According to one witness, 4 people pinned down Joanna's limbs as she struggled against them. She then went on to fight against Luke, attempting to remove his hands from her neck. As she did this, she repeatedly cried no, but the followers continued to hold Joanna down because they thought this was the demon speaking. According to Luke, the demon finally told him it was leaving her body, and a few seconds later, Joanna stopped breathing. After this, Luke ordered his followers to put her body into one of the bedrooms. He claimed that Joanna wasn't dead, she was just temporarily in heaven. Within days, a foul odour began to emanate from the bedroom, and her body became swollen and discoloured. One of the church followers tried to revive the 37-year-old, but to no avail. When the body was finally called into police, it was due to a neighbor discovering the body. They had been asked by the group to be their media representative for when the story of a young woman's miraculous revival finally broke. Luke was charged in relation to Joanna's death. He refused offers of legal aid, dropped his lawyer, and presented no defense, nor did he question any of the witnesses himself. He continued to claim that Joanna would rise from the dead, and that all of this was needless. At the trial in November 2001, one of Luke's followers told the story of how they themselves had nearly ended up like Joanna. The follower said that Luke had exorcised them too, and that they'd only survived by faking a coughing fit so that Luke would believe the demons had been expelled and would stop choking them. The follower also described Joanna as a quiet introvert who was devoted to the church and strived to fulfill Luke's wishes. The jury returned Luke's verdict in 4 hours. He was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 6 years in prison, after which he would be deported back to his native South Korea. In 2004, Luke began to appeal his case, and in 2005 a retrial was ordered, but by this point, all the witnesses were back in Korea. In April of 2006, Luke won the appeal against his conviction. The Court of Appeal stated that Joanna's possible consent to the exorcism had not been properly considered during Luke's first trial. After Luke's trial, the God of All Church disbanded, with most of its followers returning to South Korea. Neither Joanna Lee's friends nor relatives could be located for funeral arrangements, so in mid-2001, the Auckland Korean community performed a Christian funeral service for her, and her body was cremated. Marie Manning. Marie Manning was born Marie de Roux in Lausanne, Switzerland, 1821, and entered the domestic service line of work when she moved to England. Marie started off as a maid to Lady Palk of Haldon House, near Exeter in Devon, before going on to be maid to Lady Blantyre of Stafford House in the West End of London in 1846. The jobs that Marie worked led to her gaining a taste for a luxurious lifestyle that she simply couldn't afford on her wages. They also led to her obtaining a fear of living in poverty. This lust for a lavish life is ultimately what led to her downfall. On May 27, 1947, Marie, 28, married publican Frederick George Manning at St. James's Church in Piccadilly. Fred had a checkered past. He'd worked on the railways, but ended up being discharged after it was suspected that he was involved in several robberies. Prior to her marriage to Fred, Marie had also been seeing another man, a 50-year-old named Patrick O'Connor. Patrick was a gouger, or a tax collector, on the London docks, and was also a moneylender who charged significant interest, which led to him garnering an impressive amount of wealth. Initially, Marie had been torn between the two men, who both expressed an interest in taking her hand in marriage. Fred was of her age, but a less reputable character and earned less money. Patrick was older and a heavy drinker, but wealthier. In the end, Marie was swayed by Fred, who claimed that he would soon inherit a large sum of money. However, it wasn't long after the couple were married that Marie realized the inheritance wasn't coming. Dissatisfied with this relationship, or perhaps more precisely, the lack of money within it, Marie continued her affair with Patrick. It is unclear exactly how Marie's plot came into fruition. Driven by money and greed, she hatched a plan to kill Patrick O'Connor and take his wealth, purchasing a shovel and some quicklime in preparation. On August 8th, Patrick dined with Marie and Fred in their home in a district in southeast London. While Marie had intended for Patrick to come alone, he had brought a friend, so the foursome enjoyed each other's company and ate dinner together. Marie invited Patrick for dinner again the following night, requesting that he come alone. So, on August 9th, Patrick did so. While Patrick washed up before dinner, Marie shot him in the back of the head with a pistol. However, the wound did not immediately kill him, so Fred bashed his head in with a crowbar. Patrick's grave had already been dug by the couple in their kitchen beneath the flagstone floor, and they placed him in it, covering his body with quicklime, which they believed would speed up the decay of his flesh. Within days, Marie had been to visit Patrick's lodgings on Greenwood Street. She conned her way past the landlady, who let her into the home, and she stole his railway shares, gold jewellery and cash before leaving. Worried she might have missed valuable objects or money, she returned the following day, but found nothing new. 2 days later, 2 of Patrick's friends came around looking for him, knowing he had dinner with the couple on the night of the 9th. Marie and Fred suspected that 2 men were police, and so they decided to leave London immediately. Marie, however, had intended on double-crossing her husband the entire time. She sent him off to sell furniture for money, and while he was gone, she packed up all the valuables she could and left without him. By the time that the pair fled, separately, from London, Patrick had been reported missing, and the police expressed their suspicions about Marie and her husband. Upon investigating the couple's home a week after the murder, they found a damp cornerstone on their floor, which led to the body's discovery on August 17th. Marie Manning was tracked down in Edinburgh, where Scottish police had already arrested her for trying to sell Patrick's railway stock, which was known to be stolen. Fred Manning was arrested a week later on Jersey, a British Crown dependency off the coast of France. He had been seen by a man who knew him in London and who had read about the murders. In custody, Fred told police that Marie had shot Patrick, but that he had been the one to use the crowbar on him, saying, "I never liked him, so I battered his head with a ripping chisel." It's unclear what exactly Fred's motive was for participating in the murder. Was he driven by money, like his wife? Or did he want to kill the man who he considered his rival? Or maybe he just wanted to protect himself and his wife from facing jail. The couple were tried at the Old Bailey on October 25th and 26th, 1849. Interestingly, according to reports, it was argued that the jury had to include people of French and Swiss ancestry in fairness to Marie. During the trial, both Marie's and Fred's lawyers tried to pin the blame on the other party. The jury took 45 minutes to find the pair guilty, which led to Marie losing her cool, ranting, raving and swearing at the jury and the court officials, labelling the British as deceitful and untrustworthy. They were sentenced to death for their crime. Marie was guarded around the clock while in custody awaiting her death. She was considered a suicide risk, and 2 years prior, another woman had hung herself in the jail cell, so authorities took precaution to protect Marie's life until she could be executed properly. 3 other women slept in Marie's jail cell with her. Eventually, when her nails were long enough, Marie attempted to strangle herself and puncture her own windpipe, but the 3 women worked together to stop her. Failing to take her own life, she wrote to Queen Victoria, whom she had met through her employer, Lady Blantyre. However, Queen Victoria thought her sentencing was just, and so denied her request for a reprieve. Growing increasingly desperate, Marie then attempted to make amends with her husband, and asked him to take full responsibility for the murder. Fred refused. Marie and Fred Manning were hanged on November 13th, 1849. This was the first time a married couple had been executed together in England since 1700. Marie wore a black satin dress to her execution, resulting in the suggestion that as a result of her wearing it, the material went out of fashion for some time after. This is a colourful but untrue wives' tale. The public execution was attended by an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 people. Charles Dickens was one of the attendees, and he went on to base one of his characters on Marie's life. This character was Mademoiselle Hortense, a maid in the book Bleak House. The murder of Patrick O'Connor by Marie and Fred Manning was dubbed the Bermondsey Horror, and its gruesome nature haunted the London area for years afterwards. Kate Webster. Also dubbed the Barnes Mystery or the Richmond Mystery, the murder of Julia Martha Thomas was carried out by Kate Webster in 1879 and was one of the most notorious crimes of the late 19th century. Julia Martha Thomas was a 54-year-old woman who lived in Richmond, a suburban town of southwest London. A former schoolteacher, Julia had been a widower twice over. She was described as a small, well-dressed lady and was known to travel frequently, while neighbours saw her as an eccentric woman. She was not particularly wealthy, but she dressed up and wore shimmering jewellery that made it look like she was. Since her second husband died in 1873, Julia had lived alone at 2 Mayfield cottages on Park Road, Richmond. It was not a heavily populated area, which perhaps explains why neighbours were slow to catch on to Julia's death in March of 1879. Despite her charming, put-together appearance, Julia was well known for being a harsh employer with irregular habits. As a result, she struggled to find servants who were willing to stick out whatever she threw at them, with most lasting just weeks at a time. On January 29, 1879, Julia took on a 30-year-old Irish woman named Kate Webster. Born Kate Lawler in 1849, the details of Kate's early life and upbringing are unclear. In December of 1864, aged 15, Kate was imprisoned for larceny in Wexford, before coming to England 3 years later in 1867. However, England did not seem to suit Kate any better, as she frequently ran into trouble with the law. In 1868, she was sentenced to 4 years of penal servitude for committing larceny in Liverpool. She was finally released in January of 1872, and by 1873 she had moved to Rose Gardens in Hammersmith, West London. Kate claimed to have been once married to a sea captain by whom she had 4 children. According to her, all 5 of them died within a short time of one another. Looking through all the sources that are available, I can't confirm if this is true or not, but what we do know is that on April 18, 1874, she gave birth to a son named John W. Webster. The true identity of John's father is unknown, and she named various fathers at different times. Some reports have claimed that Kate participated in sex work on the side, and this is how she came to be a mother. After having her son, Kate began to move around West London frequently, using different aliases. In May of 1875, she was convicted of 36 charges of larceny and spent 18 months in Wandsworth Prison. She was soon arrested again and sentenced to a further year in February of 1877. During this time, her son John was cared for by Sarah Creese, a woman who worked as a cleaner for Miss Loder in Richmond. In January of 1879, Sarah fell ill, so she asked Kate to take her place at work. Miss Loder was familiar with Julia Thomas, and so recommended Kate to her, as Julia required a new servant. Julia hired the Irish woman on the spot, having no questions about her past or character. Initially, it seems the pair got on well, but it didn't take long for the relationship between Julia and Kate to deteriorate. Kate's quality of work was constantly criticised and complained about by her employer, and as Kate's resentment grew, Julia found herself becoming increasingly concerned about her safety when the two were alone together. She often attempted to persuade her friends to stay with her while Kate worked. Between this and the fact that Kate frequented the nearby pub, something which irritated the 54-year-old, the relationship completely fell apart. Eventually, the two arranged that Kate would leave Julia's employment on February 28th. Julia had even noted this down in her final diary entry, where she scrawled, "Gave Catherine warning to leave." However, this didn't go as planned. Kate convinced Julia to keep her on for a further 3 days until Sunday, March 2nd. That day, Kate was expected to return and help Julia prepare for the evening service at church, but Kate returned late, having visited the local pub again. The two women argued, and Julia arrived at the service very agitated. She told of how her servant had made her late, and that Kate had, quote, flown into a terrible passion after being told off. The older woman arrived home again at around 9 p.m. and confronted Kate once more. According to Kate's later confession, during this argument she threw Julia from the top of the stairs, and to prevent her from screaming, which may end up leading to Kate's arrest, she decided to strangle the 54-year-old to death. While the neighbours heard a thump around this time, they thought nothing of it. Things took a chilling turn after this, however, as Kate decided that she needed to dismember the body so that she could conceal it. She utilised a razor, carving knife and meat saw in order to take the body into pieces, before boiling the body parts and burning the bones in the hearth. Over the next few days, Kate dedicated her time to cleaning the house and Julia's clothing. She otherwise went about her day as if nothing had happened. It seemed that the young woman showed no remorse for what she had done, as she began to parcel up the remains of Julia. Kate put the remains into 2 boxes, but Julia's head and feet wouldn't fit. She left the feet in a rubbish heap near Twickenham, and she buried the head beneath the stables of the local pub nearby. On March 4th, she deposited the 2 boxes into the River Thames. One of these boxes has never been recovered, while the other washed up and was found by a coal porter who alerted authorities when he opened it and found body parts wrapped in brown paper inside. It wasn't long before the feet that had been dumped in the rubbish tip were located too, although there was nothing that could identify who the body parts belonged to. A doctor who examined the remains claimed they belonged to a young person with dark hair. What corpse could be found was laid to rest in Barnes Cemetery on March 19th. The local media speculated that the body had been used for dissection and anatomical study. Meanwhile, Kate remained in Julia's house. She wore Julia's clothing and dealt with the tradesman under her new identity. She made a deal with a man named John Church to sell Julia's furniture. Little did Kate know that this would be the thing to blow her cover. When a removal horse and cart arrived on March 18th, neighbours grew suspicious, having not seen Julia in 2 weeks. The landlady of the home and one of Julia's neighbours, Miss Ives, asked the delivery men who had ordered the removal. One of them pointed to Kate and said, "Mrs. Thomas." Realising she'd been caught, Kate took off. She fled first to Liverpool and then to her family home in Ireland. The authorities were called and they began to search the home, where they found bloodstains, burned finger bones and fatty deposits. A letter left behind by Kate had her address in Ireland written on it. It didn't take long before a wanted notice went out for Kate Webster, describing her and her son. Detectives soon found out she'd fled to Ireland with her son John, and the head constable of the Royal Irish Constabulary realised that the girl from the wanted poster was the same girl he'd arrested for larceny 14 years ago. Kate was eventually arrested on March 29th. Upon hearing of her crime, her uncle refused to give her son shelter, and so the authorities sent him to the local workhouse until a place could be found for him in an industrial school. The case of Julia Thomas blew up. The media was in a frenzy as the story unravelled before them, and people travelled to Richmond to see the cottage where it all happened. Prior to her trial, Kate had attempted to implicate John Church, the man who was going to buy Julia's belongings, and also her old neighbour, a man named Porter. Both of the men had solid alibis, however, which cleared them of any involvement. During the trial, which occurred at the Old Bailey on July 2nd, a bonnet maker came forward and said that the week before the murder occurred, Kate had told her that she had plans to go to Birmingham to sell goods, jewellery and a house that her aunt had left her. This left the impression that the murder of Julia Thomas was premeditated and not accidental, as Kate later claimed. Kate entered a plea of not guilty, and her defence emphasised that the evidence against her was circumstantial and that she was a devoted mother who was incapable of murdering anyone. However, Kate's unpopularity and her impassive demeanour did not impress the jury, who found her guilty within an hour and 15 minutes after a 6-day trial. Before her execution, Kate made 2 statements, in one of which she implicated a man named Strong, the supposed father of her child, whom she later said led her to a life of crime and had participated in the murder. Kate also tried to avoid her death sentence, claiming that she was pregnant, but this was rejected. Then, on July 28th, Kate recanted all her accusations, definitively clearing Porter, Church and Strong of any involvement, and she took sole responsibility for the murder and dismemberment of Julia Thomas. Kate was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on July 29, 1879, and was buried in an unmarked grave in one of the prison's exercise yards. Kate was only the 2nd person hanged at the prison, and of the 135 people who came to die there, she was the only woman. The cottage where the events unfolded stood unoccupied until 1897. People simply refused to live in it after the murder. Even when the new tenant arrived and made themselves at home in the old cottage, servants were hard to come by and reluctant to take any jobs there. Interestingly, in a grisly sort of way, items that had once belonged to Julia were auctioned off, including the knife which had dismembered her and the copper that had boiled the body. Some people took small stones and twigs from the garden as morbid souvenirs. In October of 2010, Julia's skull was found by workmen who had been carrying out building work for Sir David Attenborough. It had been buried underneath the pub's foundations since Kate Webster had stashed it there in the 1870s. There is also an eerie tale attached to Julia's story, which says that Kate offered jars of the older woman's body fat to a publican, neighbours and children, claiming that it was lard. This is unproven, but a grisly thought nonetheless. Richard Dadd. Born in Chatham, Kent, on August 1st, 1817, Richard Dadd was a renowned English painter, known for his depictions of fairies and other supernatural subjects. His most popular works were created when he was staying in Broadmoor Hospital, but the story of how he got there is both tragic and chilling at the same time. Richard was born to a chemist named Robert and his wife Mary Ann, and was one of 7 children. He lost his mother at the age of 7, and his father went on to remarry. As a child, Richard attended King's School in Rochester. His drawing skills became evident very quickly and from a very young age. When he turned 20, he attended the Royal Academy of Arts. 3 years later, in 1840, Richard was awarded a medal for his life drawing skills. At some point during his early career, he is noted to have also attended William Dadson's Academy of Art. Then, along with other significant artists of the time like Augustus Egg and William Powell Frith, Richard founded what was known as the Clique, a group of young and ambitious English artists who favoured genre painting instead of academic high art. They shared the belief that art should be judged by the public and not by its conformity to academic ideals. Of all these skilled artists who were a part of the group, Richard was heavily considered the leading talent. In July of 1842, Sir Thomas Phillips, a Welsh lawyer and politician, chose Richard to accompany him as a draftsman on an expedition through Europe and the Middle East, with the pair travelling to Greece, Turkey, Syria and Egypt. In November of that same year, they spent 2 weeks in South Syria, passing from Jerusalem to Jordan and returning across the En-Gadi wilderness. Then, at the end of December, while travelling up the Nile by boat, Richard underwent a drastic personality change, becoming delusional and increasingly violent. He claimed that he was being watched by someone who was attempting to cause him harm, and as the pair made their way up the Nile, they discussed religion and the Egyptian gods. By the time they arrived in Paris, their last stop, Richard ended up returning home alone. In gallery paintings, he saw demonic horns and occult messages. His strange, perplexing behaviour had most of those around him believing he was suffering sunstroke or some sort of mental breakdown. When Richard returned home in the spring of 1843, he was diagnosed with having an unsound mind. His family took him in to recuperate in the rural village of Cobham, Kent. On August 28th that year, Richard and his father had drinks together and then decided to go for a walk around 9 p.m. While out walking through the park, Richard, 26 at the time, punched his father before cutting his throat with a razor and stabbing him with a 5-inch sailor's knife. Reportedly, afterwards, he told authorities that Osiris, the Egyptian god, had told him to carry out this attack. Upon killing his father, Richard fled to France. En route to Paris, he attempted to kill another passenger with a razor, inflicting several wounds on the innocent man before police overpowered and arrested him. Richard claimed he was the son and envoy of God, sent to exterminate men most possessed with the demon. He went on to confess to murdering his father and was returned to the United Kingdom for punishment. Back home, Richard was deemed unfit for trial and committed to the criminal department of the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Later, he would be transferred to Broadmoor. In both hospitals, Richard was cared for by 3 doctors. He is suspected to have suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, which was, back in the 1800s, not something that was commonly spoken about or recognised until 1878. Reportedly, 2 of his siblings had also suffered from the condition, while another had a private attendant, for unknown reasons. During his time in hospital, Richard was actively encouraged to continue painting. In 1852, he created a portrait of one of his doctors, Alexander Morrison, which to this day hangs in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. While in psychiatric care, he also painted one of his most famous pieces, the Fairy Fella's Masterstroke, which he worked on for almost a decade between the ages of 1855 and 1864. and which inspired Freddie Mercury to later pen a song of the same name. Richard spent 20 years in Bethlehem before being moved to Broadmoor, where he lived out his remaining years, painting constantly and receiving infrequent visitors until his death on January 7th, 1886. He passed away from an extensive disease of the lungs. However, the murder and the assault he committed prior to his stays in psychiatric care were not forgotten about while he was in hospital. According to doctors, Richard spoke about the murder as if it was perfectly executed, his story theatrical, and his mood unregretful. He was also known to lash out at other inmates and insist that the son of Osiris dwelled within his body, but he would apologize for his outbursts afterwards. Doctors noted that he became less violent with age, but that he continued to suffer under his delusions until the day of his death. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. If you're still hungry for true crime content, you can check out the Cold Case Detective podcast by following the link below. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.